A world existed where the Force did not move gently. It did not guide. It did not whisper. On that world, the Force bled. Far from the shining lanes of the Republic, beyond the calm temples of the Jedi, there was a planet wrapped in shadow and mist. Its name was Dathomir. To travelers who saw it from orbit, it looked almost peaceful, a red world covered in forests, mountains, and deep marshlands. But the moment one stepped onto its surface, that illusion disappeared. The air itself felt heavy. The ground breathed with something ancient, and the Force behaved differently there. Most worlds carried the Force like a quiet current beneath the surface of life. Jedi described it as balance, something that flowed through every living thing. On Dathomir, that balance had long ago twisted into something darker, something raw, something older. The soil of the planet was rich with strange minerals, glowing faintly green beneath the mud and roots of the forests. Deep beneath the swamps, hidden from the sky, ancient veins of energy pulsed through the planet's core. The Nightsisters would later call it Ichor. To the Jedi, it was simply another manifestation of the dark side. But on Dathomir, it was not treated as something forbidden. It was treated as a birthright. Long before the Republic recorded the planet on its star charts, Dathomir already had its own stories. Strange creatures roamed the forests, beasts large enough to shake the ground beneath their feet. Among them were Rancors, towering predators with claws like blades and jaws strong enough to crush bone, and most worlds would have feared such creatures. On Dathomir, they were eventually tamed. But the true mystery of the planet was not its creatures. It was the presence that lived within the swamps. Those who were sensitive to the Force felt it immediately. A pressure in the mind, a quiet whisper that seemed to come from the ground itself. The deeper one traveled into the forests and marshes, the stronger that presence became. Jedi explorers who studied the planet centuries later struggled to describe it. Some believed Dathomir had once been the site of ancient dark side rituals, long forgotten by history. Others believed the planet itself had always been connected to something deeper within the Force. But the truth was more unsettling, because on Dathomir, the Force was not studied. It was lived, and eventually, it was mastered. And the first settlers who lived on the world were not warriors or conquerors. They were survivors. Over time, small tribes began to form among the forests and mountains. These early inhabitants learned quickly that life on Dathomir demanded strength. But strength alone was not enough. The planet rewarded those who listened, those who adapted. And among these tribes, something unusual began to appear. Some children were born with a deeper connection to the energy beneath the planet's surface. They could feel the presence moving through the ground. They sensed the strange green currents hidden beneath the swamps. At first, these abilities were feared. Then they were respected. And slowly, they were taught. Over generations, the knowledge grew. Whispers became rituals. Rituals became traditions. And traditions became power. And the women who practiced these abilities began to separate themselves from the rest of the tribes. They studied the strange energy of the planet more closely. They learned how to call it forward through chants and symbols carved into bone and stone. Unlike the Jedi, they did not attempt to control their emotions. They embraced them. Fear became a tool. Pain became focus. Anger became strength. From the outside, these practices would one day be labeled as dark side sorcery. But to those who lived on Dathomir, it was simply survival. These women were not yet called Nightsisters. That name would come later. For now, They were simply the first witches of Dathomir. Women who understood that the world beneath their feet held a power the rest of the galaxy had never seen. And they built their homes along the edges of the swamps where the Ichor was strongest. Their villages were not like the shining cities of the core worlds. They were made from bone, wood, and stone, structures shaped by the environment around them. Everything they built followed the shape of the land, because the land itself was sacred. And deep within the forests of Dathomir, something ancient had begun to awaken. A tradition, a lineage, a power that would one day spread fear across the galaxy. But the witches of Dathomir did not yet know how important their world would become. They did not yet know that the Jedi would one day fear their power, or that the Sith would try to use it. For now, Dathomir remained what it had always been, a distant world, a quiet world, a world where the Force did not whisper, it bled, and the first witches had only just begun to listen. The red sky of Dathomir rarely changed. Day and night passed across the planet slowly, but the sky always carried the same deep crimson glow. Thick clouds drifted above the forests like dark curtains, allowing only thin streams of light to reach the ground below. Beneath that sky, the world felt quiet, but it was never truly silent. Wind moved through the tall black trees, water stirred slowly in the swamps, and beneath the soil, something older than memory continued to pulse. The early tribes of Dathomir learned to respect that quiet power. Life on the planet demanded constant awareness. The forests were filled with predators, and the swamps could swallow the careless without warning. But the greatest mystery of the world was not its danger. It was the feeling that something unseen was always watching. Those who were sensitive to the Force felt it most strongly. As the years passed, the women who practiced the strange rituals of the tribes began to notice patterns within the planet's energy. The Ichor beneath the ground did not move randomly. It followed currents, almost like rivers flowing beneath the surface of the world. Through patience and observation, the witches began to understand these currents. They learned where the energy gathered, where it weakened, and where it could be called upon. Their rituals slowly grew more complex. Bones were carved with symbols that represented life and death. Circles were drawn into the earth beside the swamps. Soft chants echoed through the forests at night, spoken in languages that existed long before the Republic ever charted the Outer Rim. At first, the results were small. A dying plant could be revived. A wounded creature could be healed. Fire could be summoned with a whisper. But with every generation, the witches pushed deeper into the power that surrounded them. And that power began to answer. Green mist would sometimes rise from the ground during their rituals, curling through the air like living smoke. The witches discovered they could shape that mist, guiding it with their voices and movements. Objects could appear where nothing existed moments before. Shadows could be bent and stretched until they no longer behaved naturally. To outsiders, it would one day look like sorcery. To the witches of Dathomir, it was simply magic. The rest of the tribes soon realized that these women were different. They did not hunt like the others. They did not fear the rancors that roamed the forests. In time, the witches even learned how to approach the massive creatures without provoking their rage. Slowly, impossibly, the beasts began to obey them. A rancor that could tear apart entire hunting parties would kneel quietly beside a witch who spoke the right words. That was the moment when the balance of Dathomir truly changed. The witches were no longer simply members of the tribes. They had become something greater. The strongest among them began to gather followers. Villages formed near the deepest swamps where the Ichor energy was strongest. These settlements were built from the bones of animals, twisted tree roots, and heavy stone dragged from the nearby cliffs. At their center stood ritual chambers where the witches practiced their growing power. Over time, the traditions hardened into structure. Young girls who showed signs of sensitivity were taken in and trained. They were taught how to listen to the energy beneath the planet. They were taught to control their fear when the green mist surrounded them. And most importantly, they were taught that magic was not a gift. It was a responsibility. Because the power of Dathomir was not gentle. It demanded discipline. Those who lost control of their emotions often found the energy turning against them. Some initiates disappeared into the swamps during their training, pulled beneath the dark waters by forces they did not yet understand. The witches did not mourn them. Dathomir was a harsh teacher. Only the strongest survived. But through those harsh lessons, the first true covens began to emerge. Small groups of witches bound together by shared rituals and loyalty. Each coven guarded its own knowledge, its own sacred sites, and its own understanding of the planet's power. And as the covens grew stronger, so did their influence over the rest of the world. The other tribes of Dathomir slowly adapted to this new order. Some feared the witches. Others respected them as protectors of the planet. But none dared challenge them openly, because everyone on Dathomir understood one simple truth. The witches were listening to something far older than any tribe, something that lived beneath the swamps, something that had been waiting for centuries. And with every passing generation, the bond between the witches and that ancient power grew stronger, and the galaxy beyond Dathomir remained unaware of what was forming there. Republic ships traveled their trade routes. The Jedi studied the Force within their temples, and the Sith pursued their own secrets in the shadows. None of them yet realized that, on a distant red world at the edge of the Outer Rim, a new tradition of the dark side was quietly taking shape. Not through conquest, not through war, but through patience, through survival, through the quiet voices of witches speaking to the living heart of their world. Time moved slowly on Dathomir. Years passed, then decades, and eventually centuries. The wider galaxy changed with every generation. Republic borders expanded, new hyperspace routes were discovered, and the Jedi Order continued its quiet duty of guarding peace across the stars. But Dathomir remained almost untouched by those events. The planet existed in isolation, far from the attention of the core worlds. Few ships ever traveled near it, and even fewer attempted to land. Those who did often left quickly, unsettled by the strange atmosphere of the world, and the constant feeling that the Force itself behaved differently there. For the witches, that isolation was not a weakness. It was protection. Without interference from the outside galaxy, their traditions continued to grow stronger. The covens that had once been small circles of practitioners slowly evolved into organized societies. Knowledge was passed carefully from one generation to the next, each new witch learning the rituals that had been refined for centuries. Their abilities were no longer small tricks of healing or fire. The magic of Dathomir had become something far more powerful. The witches learned how to shape the green Ichor energy into visible forms. During rituals, thick clouds of glowing mist would rise from the ground, swirling around the witches as they spoke ancient chants. That mist could be hardened into weapons, used to cloak their movements, or even sent out to strike enemies from a distance. Some witches could pull objects from nothing more than the air itself. Others could twist the bodies of living creatures, transforming them into ghostly reflections of what they once were. And in rare cases, the most powerful among them discovered how to call back the dead. These abilities were not taught lightly. The witches understood that the power they were shaping came from the darkest currents of the Force, Unlike the Jedi, they did not divide the Force into light and dark teachings. They believed the energy of the universe simply existed in many forms. To survive on Dathomir meant learning how to use every part of it, but survival alone was no longer their only goal. As their power grew, the witches began to form a structured society. Leadership within the covens slowly became formalized. At the top stood the strongest and wisest witch, known as the Clan Mother. Her word guided the coven's decisions, from rituals and training to the protection of their sacred grounds. Below her were the acolytes, experienced witches who helped train the younger initiates. And at the base of the order were the initiates themselves, young girls who had only begun their journey into the magics of Dathomir. Training was not easy, and every initiate was required to face a trial deep within the swamps. Somewhere beneath the waters of Dathomir lived a creature the witches called the Sleeper. It was ancient, powerful, and deeply connected to the Ichor energy flowing beneath the planet. The initiates had to enter the water alone. Their task was simple in words, but terrifying in reality. They had to confront the creature and return with a piece of it. The remains would later be used to create the Water of Life, a sacred substance required for many of the coven's rituals. Those who succeeded proved that they could control their fear and draw upon the strength of the planet itself. Those who failed were often dragged beneath the dark waters. The witches did not attempt to rescue them. Dathomir demanded strength. Weakness had no place among those who wielded magic. So over time, the witches' society developed another defining feature: separation. The women who practiced magic lived apart from the male inhabitants of the planet. These men became known as the Night Brothers. They were warriors, hunters, and protectors of the coven's territories. But they did not hold power within the witches' order. The Nightsisters ruled Dathomir. The Night Brothers served them. This balance allowed the covens to maintain control of their traditions while still defending their world against threats. When necessary, the witches would ride into battle mounted upon Rancors, their massive war beasts charging through the forests under the command of magic. Such displays of power ensured that no tribe on Dathomir would dare challenge them. But even as their civilization grew stronger, and the witches never forgot the origin of their abilities, every ritual returned to the same source: the Ichor beneath the planet, the green mist rising from the swamps, the living energy that pulsed through Dathomir like the heartbeat of the world itself. And with every passing generation, the witches felt that connection becoming deeper, stronger, almost as if the planet itself had chosen them to guard its secrets, chosen them to carry a power that the rest of the galaxy had never truly understood. The Jedi believed the dark side corrupted those who used it. The witches of Dathomir believed something different. They believed power was only dangerous when it was misunderstood, and they were learning more about it every year. Soon, the covens of Dathomir would enter the greatest era of their history, a time when their power spread across the entire world, a time that would later be remembered as the golden age of the Nightsisters. But with great power always comes the shadow of something greater. And somewhere beyond the forests of Dathomir, the galaxy was slowly beginning to notice. Power on Dathomir did not arrive all at once. It grew slowly, like roots spreading beneath the surface of the world. For centuries, the covens of witches continued to deepen their connection with the Ichor that flowed through the planet. Each generation inherited rituals older than the one before it. Each clan mother carried the memory of those who had guided the covens long before her time. The witches did not see themselves as rulers. They saw themselves as guardians. Dathomir was not simply their home. It was the source of their power, and the source of their identity. Every swamp, every cliffside cavern, and every ancient tree held a piece of the energy that shaped their magic. Because of this, the witches rarely left the planet. The galaxy beyond their forests remained distant and largely unknown. Stories sometimes reached them through wandering traders or explorers who had lost their way in the Outer Rim, but those stories meant little to the covens. The Republic was far away. The Jedi were even farther. On Dathomir, survival came first, and survival required constant attention to the forces beneath the ground. The witches eventually discovered that certain places on the planet carried stronger concentrations of Ichor than others. In these locations, the green mist rose from the soil almost naturally, drifting across the swamps like ghostly fog during the night, and these places became sacred. Stone fortresses were built near them, their walls carved from the dark rock of Dathomir's cliffs. Within those structures, the witches practiced their most powerful rituals. The chambers were lit not by fire or machinery, but by the faint glow of the Ichor itself. The air inside these sanctuaries always carried the scent of herbs, oils, and damp earth. It was there that the witches refined their magic. Some rituals allowed them to hide entire villages beneath illusions of shadow. Others gave them the ability to strengthen their warriors, filling their bodies with unnatural endurance and rage during battle. But the most dangerous rituals were those that touched the boundary between life and death. A few clan mothers learned how to summon the spirits of the dead, calling them back through the veil that separated the living from the spirit world. These spirits did not return peacefully. They arrived surrounded by swirling clouds of green mist, their forms twisted by the energy that pulled them back. The witches spoke with them, learned from them, and sometimes commanded them. Such practices would have been considered deeply forbidden by the Jedi Order. The Jedi believed the dead should remain within the Force, becoming one with the greater balance of the universe. The witches of Dathomir believed the dead still had knowledge to share. For them, death was not an ending. It was a doorway, and the Ichor beneath the planet gave them the key. Through these rituals, the covens became something more than a simple society. They became a lineage, a chain of knowledge and power stretching back through countless generations. Every clan mother protected the teachings of those who came before her. Every initiate carried the future of the covens forward, and the planet itself remained at the center of it all. Dathomir was alive in ways few worlds were. Its creatures, its forests, and even its swamps seemed to respond to the presence of the witches. Rancors allowed themselves to be tamed. The land provided herbs used in potions and elixirs. Even the most violent storms seemed to avoid the sacred grounds where the covens gathered. To outsiders, this relationship would have looked unnatural. To the witches, it was simply balance. But balance rarely remains undisturbed forever. As the centuries passed, whispers of Dathomir slowly began to spread beyond the Outer Rim. Explorers spoke of strange women who commanded beasts and summoned green fire from the ground. Travelers told stories of rituals performed beneath a red sky, where voices echoed through the swamps long after night had fallen. Many dismissed these stories as exaggeration. Others believed them. Among those who listened carefully were the Jedi, and eventually, the Sith. Neither order fully understood what was growing on that distant world, but both sensed that the witches of Dathomir possessed something unusual, a form of dark side power unlike anything taught in their own traditions. For the covens, those distant whispers meant nothing. Their attention remained fixed on the swamps, the rituals, and the ancient energy flowing beneath their feet. They believed Dathomir would always remain their sanctuary. They believed their power would remain hidden forever. But the Force rarely allows powerful secrets to stay buried. One day, the wider galaxy would discover what had been growing on that red world for centuries. The witches would gain a new name, a name that would spread through Jedi records, Sith archives, and whispered stories across the stars. They would become known as the Nightsisters, and their story was only just beginning. Long before the Nightsisters ruled the swamps of Dathomir, there was a woman whose name would slowly fade into legend. Her name was Allya. The witches who lived on Dathomir would later speak of her with quiet respect, almost like a distant ancestor whose memory had become blurred with time. Some believed she was the true founder of their order. Others believed she was simply the one who gave their traditions direction. Even the witches themselves could not fully agree on the truth. But nearly every story began the same way. Allya had once been a Jedi. The details of her life within the Jedi Order were never clearly recorded. By the time historians of the Republic began studying the Nightsisters, the Jedi archives contained no clear record of an exile named Allya, and some scholars believed the records had been lost over centuries of war. Others suspected that the truth had been deliberately removed. Whatever the reason, the official history of the Jedi never spoke her name. Yet the legends of Dathomir never forgot it. According to those stories, Allya lived during a time when the Jedi Order maintained strict discipline over its students. The Jedi believed emotions such as anger, fear, and attachment could lead a Force user toward the dark side. For most Jedi, these teachings became a path to balance. For Allya, they became a source of conflict. The stories say she questioned the limits placed upon her. She believed the Force was larger than the narrow path the Jedi followed. She sensed that the Force could be shaped in ways the Order refused to explore. But curiosity was dangerous within the Jedi Temple. Those who pushed too far beyond tradition often found themselves facing the judgment of the Council. And eventually, Allya did. The decision was simple. She would be exiled. The Jedi did not imprison her, nor did they execute her. Instead, they followed an older punishment once used for wayward Force users. They sent her away, alone, far from the reach of the Order. Her destination was a remote world on the edge of known space, Dathomir. At that time, the planet had not yet been studied by the Republic. It existed only as a distant name within scattered exploration charts. The Jedi believed sending Allya there would remove her influence from the Order without spilling blood. They expected the harsh world to keep her isolated. Perhaps they even believed she would disappear there. And in a way, they were right. When Allya arrived on Dathomir, she stepped into a world that felt nothing like the peaceful worlds of the Republic. The forests were thick and twisted. The air carried the smell of damp soil and strange minerals. Creatures moved through the shadows with quiet patience. But what unsettled her most was the Force. On other worlds, the Force flowed like a calm river beneath life. On Dathomir, it surged like a storm beneath the ground. The moment Allya reached the surface, she felt it. A deep pulse moving through the soil. A presence older than the Republic. Older than the Jedi. The energy beneath the planet felt raw and uncontrolled. It pressed against her mind, almost as if the world itself was aware of her arrival. For a Jedi trained to maintain calm balance, the sensation was overwhelming. But Allya did not run from it. She listened. Days turned into weeks as she explored the strange world around her. She observed the creatures that roamed the forests. She watched the early tribes who had already made Dathomir their home. And slowly, she began to notice something. The people of Dathomir already felt the planet's power. They did not understand it the way the Jedi understood the Force. But they lived with it. They respected it. Some among them even touched it. Women within the tribes practiced small rituals beside the swamps, speaking quiet chants while drawing shapes into the earth. The results were subtle but real. Plants healing faster, wounds closing more quickly, fires starting with unnatural ease. Allya recognized the energy immediately. It was the Force, but it was being used in a way she had never seen before. For the first time since her exile, Allya began to see something unexpected within her punishment. Opportunity. The Jedi had sent her to the edge of the galaxy to remove her influence. Instead, they had placed her on a world where the Force flowed stronger than anywhere she had ever known. And on that distant, red planet, Allya began to learn a new way to listen. Allya had arrived on Dathomir as an exile, but the world did not treat her like one. Days passed as she explored the forests and marshlands, slowly learning the rhythm of the strange planet. Dathomir was not a silent world. Life moved everywhere, in the trees, in the waters, and in the shadows beneath the red sky. Creatures watched from the undergrowth. Rancors moved through the forests like ancient guardians, and the Force moved differently than it did anywhere else. And Allya had spent years studying the Force under the strict teachings of the Jedi Order. She had learned to quiet her emotions, to listen carefully, and to move with balance. The Jedi believed the Force flowed best through calm minds. But on Dathomir, calm alone was not enough. The energy beneath the planet felt wild, uncontrolled. At times it surged through the ground like a heartbeat. At other moments it rested quietly beneath the swamps, waiting for something to awaken it again. The more Allya listened to that presence, the more she realized something important. The Force here was not broken. It was simply different. The tribes who lived on Dathomir had already begun adapting to it. They did not have Jedi training or ancient holocrons to guide them, but they possessed something equally powerful: instinct. Allya began watching them from a distance. The tribes lived in small settlements near the forests and cliffs, building their homes from wood, bone, and stone. Their lives were harsh, shaped by the dangers of the world around them. Hunters moved carefully through the trees, always aware that larger predators might be watching from the shadows. Yet even within these tribes, Allya noticed something unusual. Some women practiced rituals beside the swamps. They knelt near the water at night, speaking quiet chants while drawing symbols into the mud. The rituals were simple, but Allya could feel the energy responding to them. The Force moved when they spoke. Small flames appeared in their hands. Plants seemed to grow stronger around them. Sometimes a wounded creature would rise again after their rituals were complete. And the women did not fully understand what they were doing, but they were touching the Force. For Allya, the discovery changed everything. The Jedi had always believed that proper training was necessary to use the Force safely. Their temples existed to guide young students and prevent them from falling to the dark side. Without that guidance, Force sensitivity often led to fear or destruction. But here on Dathomir, something different had happened. The Force had shaped its own traditions. The women of the tribes had developed their own ways of reaching it, guided only by experience and survival. Their rituals lacked the structure of Jedi teachings, yet they carried a strange effectiveness. Allya realized that these people did not need to be controlled or corrected. They needed understanding. Slowly, she began approaching them. So at first, the tribes treated her with caution. She was an outsider, dressed in robes unlike anything they had seen before. Her speech carried the tone of distant worlds, and her knowledge of the Force felt strange to them. But Dathomir respected strength, and Allya possessed strength. When predators threatened the villages, she used the Force to drive them away. When illness spread among the tribes, she helped heal the wounded with techniques learned during her years as a Jedi. These acts slowly earned their trust. The women who practiced the swamp rituals were the first to accept her guidance. They listened carefully when she spoke about the Force. They watched as she demonstrated the control the Jedi had taught her. And in return, they showed her something the Jedi had never allowed her to explore: emotion. And the rituals of the tribes were not calm or quiet like Jedi meditation. They were intense, fueled by passion and instinct. The women spoke loudly, moving their hands through the green mist that sometimes rose from the swamps. Fear sharpened their focus. Pain strengthened their will. Even anger could push their power further. For the Jedi, such emotions were dangerous. For the tribes of Dathomir, they were tools. Allya stood between these two worlds. She carried the discipline of the Jedi within her, yet she could see the strength hidden inside the traditions of the tribes. Over time, she began blending the two approaches together. She taught the women how to guide the Force with greater control. They taught her how to listen to the living energy of the planet. Together, their knowledge began to change. The rituals grew stronger, yet the connection between the women and the swamps deepened. And slowly, without realizing it, Allya began shaping the first true teachings that would one day guide the witches of Dathomir. The Jedi had sent her into exile to silence her curiosity. Instead, that curiosity had found a new home, far from the temples of the Republic, beneath the red sky of Dathomir. A new understanding of the Force was quietly taking shape, one that neither the Jedi nor the Sith had ever imagined. Time changed Allya, not quickly and not in ways that could be seen at first. But as seasons passed beneath the red sky of Dathomir, the distance between the woman she had once been and the woman she was becoming slowly grew. When she had first arrived, she still carried the discipline of the Jedi within her. She followed their teachings, spoke their philosophies, and believed that balance in the Force required control above all things. But Dathomir was not a world that encouraged control. It encouraged survival. The tribes who lived there did not have the luxury of calm meditation, while predators hunted outside their homes. Their lives demanded strength, instinct, and the ability to act without hesitation. Fear was not something they ignored. Fear was something they learned to master. Allya began to understand this difference more clearly with every passing year. The women she trained were growing stronger. Their connection to the Force deepened as they practiced the rituals beside the swamps. The green mist rising from the ground began responding to them more easily, swirling around their hands as they spoke the chants Allya helped refine. But these rituals were no longer the same ones the tribes had once practiced. Allya had changed them. She had begun recording her teachings, using pieces of bone and thin sheets of cured hide. She wrote down the principles she believed would guide the future of the witches. These writings eventually became known as the Book of Law. It was not a Jedi text, and it was not a Sith one either. The Book of Law reflected the strange balance Allya had discovered between discipline and instinct. It taught the witches how to shape the power of Dathomir without losing themselves to it. It warned them that the Force beneath the planet was strong, but also dangerous. Most importantly, it warned them about the Jedi. Allya had never forgotten the moment she was exiled. She had been a loyal student of the Order, yet the Council had judged her curiosity as a threat. Instead of guiding her questions, they had cast her aside and abandoned her on a distant world. Over time, that memory hardened inside her. The Book of Law did not speak kindly of the Jedi. Allya wrote that the Jedi feared power they could not control. She warned the witches that the Order would never understand the magic of Dathomir. If the Jedi ever discovered their growing strength, they would attempt to destroy it or claim it for themselves. The witches listened carefully to these teachings. For many of them, Allya was not simply a teacher. She was proof that the wider galaxy could not be trusted. Her exile became a story repeated among the covens. Mothers told it to their daughters as they trained beside the swamps. The tale of the Jedi who had rejected their own students slowly transformed into something deeper. A quiet resentment. A belief that the witches of Dathomir must always rely on themselves. Under Allya's guidance, the structure of their society continued to evolve. The women who showed the strongest connection to the Force were gathered together into organized groups. These groups began calling themselves covens. Each coven shared the teachings of the Book of Law, but they also developed their own rituals and traditions. Some focused on healing and protection. Others studied the darker aspects of the planet's power, experimenting with spells that could strengthen warriors or weaken enemies. Allya did not forbid these experiments. Instead, she observed them. She believed that knowledge could only grow through experience. Yet the witches would need to understand the full nature of the power they carried, even the parts that frightened them. But she also warned them never to forget the lesson written at the heart of the Book of Law. Power must always serve the survival of the coven. Not pride, not ambition, survival. That belief slowly became the foundation of the witches' culture. Every ritual, every trial, and every lesson passed to the next generation carried the same purpose. Protect the coven, protect Dathomir, trust no one beyond the red sky. Years continued to pass. Allya grew older, but the traditions she had created continued spreading among the tribes of Dathomir. The women she had trained were now training their own students. The Book of Law was copied and preserved within the ritual chambers of each coven. The Jedi who had exiled her likely believed her influence had vanished. But the opposite had happened. On the distant world they had chosen for her punishment, Allya had built something entirely new. A tradition shaped by exile. A tradition shaped by survival. And the witches who followed her teachings would carry that tradition long after her voice was gone. Allya did not live forever. No witch of Dathomir ever believed she would. The women who followed her teachings understood that death was simply another step within the long rhythm of the Force. The swamps of Dathomir had already shown them that life and death moved in a quiet cycle, each feeding the other beneath the red sky. But before Allya's time came to an end, she had already changed the world around her. The tribes of Dathomir were no longer scattered groups struggling to survive. Through the teachings of the Book of Law, the women who studied the Force had grown into something more organized, something stronger. The covens had become the heart of their society. Within each coven, knowledge passed from elder witches to young initiates with careful patience. The rituals Allya had once written down were now repeated across the forests and swamps of the planet. Young girls who showed signs of Force sensitivity were brought before the clan mothers, where their training would begin. The path was never easy. Every initiate had to prove that she could face the power of Dathomir without losing herself to fear. The trials that awaited them were dangerous, sometimes fatal, and many were sent deep into the swamps to confront the strange creatures that lived beneath the waters. Those who returned carried pieces of those creatures as proof of their strength. Those who failed were rarely seen again. The witches accepted these losses without hesitation. Dathomir was not a forgiving world. Only those strong enough to survive its trials could safely wield the magic flowing beneath its soil. As the covens grew, the witches also began shaping the structure of their leadership. The most powerful among them became clan mothers, guardians of the coven's traditions and protectors of the sacred rituals written within the Book of Law. Their authority was absolute within the coven, but even the clan mothers honored the memory of the woman who had first guided them. Allya's name became something more than history, and it became a symbol. Among the witches, she was remembered not simply as a Jedi exile, but as the first teacher who had shown them how to shape the power of their world. Some believed she had been chosen by Dathomir itself. Others believed the Force had guided her there for a purpose the Jedi could never understand. Whatever the truth, her influence never disappeared. Long after her death, the Book of Law remained the foundation of their teachings. The distrust she had carried toward the Jedi also remained within the culture of the covens. The witches did not actively seek conflict with the Order, but they believed the Jedi would never accept their traditions. So the covens remained hidden. They lived deep within the forests and marshlands of Dathomir, building their strongholds from stone and bone along the edges of the swamps. Their rituals continued beneath the red sky, surrounded by the quiet glow of green ichor rising from the ground. And slowly, their identity began to change. The women who practiced these rituals were no longer simply witches of the tribes. They had become something new. Outsiders who heard stories about Dathomir began using a different name when they spoke about them. Travelers who had glimpsed their rituals in the swamps whispered the name carefully, unsure if the witches themselves would approve of it. The name carried both fear and respect. They called them the Nightsisters. The title reflected the life they lived beneath the dark skies of their world. It spoke of the covens that gathered during the night to perform their rituals, drawing power from the Ichor flowing beneath the planet. But the name also carried another meaning, and it described the bond between them. The witches of Dathomir were not simply students of the Force. They were sisters, bound by the teachings of Allya, bound by the trials of their world, bound by the quiet promise that their covens would always protect their own. As generations passed, the Nightsisters would grow stronger. Their magics would deepen, their rituals would evolve, and their influence would slowly spread across the history of the galaxy. But all of it began with a single exile. A Jedi who had been cast away. A woman who had arrived on a distant world and listened to the living power beneath its soil. And from that moment, the lineage of the Nightsisters had begun. The Nightsisters believed their power came from the world itself. Long before travelers from the Republic learned the name Dathomir, the witches already understood that the planet carried something unusual beneath its surface. The swamps and forests hid a deep network of strange energy, flowing through the ground like veins beneath living skin. The witches gave that energy a name, Ichor. To outsiders, it appeared as a glowing green mist that sometimes rose from the soil during their rituals. But the witches knew it was much more than simple vapor. Ichor was the breath of Dathomir itself, a dark current of the Force that pulsed quietly through the planet's depths. Every coven learned to respect it. Every ritual depended on it. And the teachings left behind by Allya had already given the witches discipline and structure. But as generations passed, the women of Dathomir discovered that the true source of their strength did not come from the Book of Law alone. It came from the living heart of the planet. The swamps became their sacred grounds. Pools of dark water marked the places where the Ichor flowed closest to the surface. When the nights grew quiet and the red sky darkened, the witches gathered beside these pools to perform their rituals. They did not meditate the way the Jedi did. They spoke. Low chants echoed across the marshlands as the witches called to the energy beneath the ground. Their voices moved slowly, repeating ancient words that had been passed down through many generations of covens. The earth responded. Green mist rose from the water, and twisting through the air like living smoke. The witches guided it with their hands, shaping the glowing clouds around their bodies. To them, this was not simply the Force. This was magic. The difference mattered. Jedi teachings described the Force as something balanced and harmonious. They believed emotions such as anger and fear could easily corrupt those who relied on them. But the witches of Dathomir did not divide the Force into light and dark the way the Jedi did. They believed power was a tool, and tools could be used in many ways. Fear sharpened their focus during rituals. Anger strengthened their connection to the Ichor flowing beneath the swamps. Even grief could deepen their understanding of the energy moving through the world around them. To the witches, these emotions were not weaknesses, they were doors. Through these doors, their magic began to grow stronger with every generation. Some witches learned to shape the mist into solid forms, creating blades or shields from the glowing energy. Others discovered how to bend the minds of living creatures, clouding their senses or filling them with sudden terror. The most powerful witches studied something even more dangerous: the boundary between life and death. The Ichor flowing beneath Dathomir seemed to touch both sides of that boundary. During certain rituals, the witches could feel the presence of spirits lingering near the edge of the physical world. These spirits did not always appear clearly, but their whispers could sometimes be heard within the green mist. The witches listened carefully. They believed the spirits carried knowledge from generations long past. For them, death was not the end of existence. It was simply another layer of the Force. As the covens continued exploring this power, their identity slowly changed. They were no longer simply students of Allya's teachings. The Book of Law had given them structure, but the Ichor of Dathomir had given them something greater, a new path through the Force, one shaped by the land beneath their feet, one that did not follow the rules of Jedi temples or Sith doctrines. The witches of Dathomir had become daughters of the Ichor. Their power flowed from the swamps, from the forests, and from the ancient energy buried deep beneath their world. And with every passing generation, that connection grew stronger. But power always demands a price. The deeper the witches reached into the Ichor, the more dangerous their rituals became, and soon, as the covens would discover that the magic of Dathomir was not meant to be used without sacrifice. The green mist did not obey everyone. Many outsiders believed the magic of Dathomir was something simple. They imagined witches raising their hands and calling power from the ground as easily as lighting a torch. But the truth was far more difficult and far more dangerous. The Ichor beneath Dathomir had a will of its own. It answered only to those who understood its nature. For the witches, learning to control the living mist was a long and often painful process. Young initiates began their training as children, brought into the covens by clan mothers who sensed their connection to the Force. At first, the girls were taught only the simplest rituals. They learned the chants. They learned the symbols carved into bone and stone. And most importantly, they learned patience. Because the Ichor did not respond to impatience. When a group of initiates gathered beside the swamps at night, the ritual always began quietly. The older witches stood nearby, watching without speaking, while the young students repeated the ancient words of summoning. The chants rose slowly into the night air, carried by the wind across the marshlands. Sometimes nothing happened. The swamps remained still, and the mist never appeared. When that happened, the witches ended the ritual without anger. The initiates returned to the coven and waited for another night. The magic of Dathomir could not be forced. But on other nights, the earth responded. Thin lines of green light began to glow beneath the water. The ground trembled slightly, as if something beneath the soil had awakened. So then the mist would rise, curling through the air like breath from the planet itself. That moment was always dangerous. The Ichor carried enormous power, and the witches understood that losing control of it could destroy the mind of an unprepared student. The initiates had to remain calm, even as the strange energy surrounded them. They guided the mist slowly with their hands. At first, their control was clumsy. The mist scattered in different directions, dissolving before the young witches could shape it. But with practice, the initiates began to feel the rhythm of the energy moving through their bodies. Their voices guided it. Their focus shaped it. Over time, the mist obeyed. Some initiates learned how to pull objects toward them using the swirling clouds of Ichor. Others could ignite small bursts of green flame within their palms. A few even discovered how to cloak themselves in the mist, disappearing into the shadows of the swamps. But every success came with a warning. The clan mothers reminded them that the Ichor was not simply a weapon. It was part of the planet. The witches had to respect it. Those who tried to command it through pride or arrogance often learned painful lessons. There were stories told within the covens of initiates who reached too far into the power of the mist. Their control slipped and the energy overwhelmed them. Some were left unconscious for days. Others never recovered their connection to the magic again. Because of this danger, the witches practiced strict discipline within their rituals. Every spell required careful preparation. Potions brewed from herbs and roots were often used to focus the mind. And the covens also created protective symbols carved into stone circles near the swamps. These symbols helped guide the Ichor safely during powerful rituals. But even with these precautions, the witches understood something important about their power. Magic was never completely safe. It came from the deepest currents of the dark side of the Force, drawn upward through the heart of Dathomir. The Jedi would have considered such power forbidden. The witches considered it necessary. Without magic, they could not protect their world. Without magic, they could not survive. So every generation continued the training. Night after night, the chants echoed across the swamps. Green mist rose beneath the red sky, swirling around the witches as they shaped it into tools of protection and strength. And slowly, the living mist of Dathomir became more than a ritual. It became the voice of the covens themselves, a voice carried through magic, a voice that the wider galaxy would one day learn to fear. Power on Dathomir was never given freely. Every witch who wished to wield the magic of the covens had to prove that she was strong enough to survive it. The clan mothers believed that the Ichor flowing beneath the planet was both a gift and a test. Those who could master it would become protectors of the covens. Those who could not would be lost to the swamps. Because of this belief, every initiate eventually faced a trial. It was a tradition older than most of the covens themselves, passed down from the earliest days after Allya's teachings began to spread across Dathomir. The trial was simple in its purpose, but terrifying in its reality. And the initiates had to enter the swamps alone. Deep within the dark waters of Dathomir lived creatures connected to the same ancient energy that powered the witches' rituals. Among these creatures was one that the covens feared and respected above all others. They called it the Sleeper. The witches rarely saw the creature clearly. It lived beneath the thick waters of the marshes, hidden far below the tangled roots and black mud. But the clan mothers knew it was powerful, ancient, and deeply tied to the Ichor beneath the planet. To pass their trial, an initiate had to face the Sleeper. She would walk alone into the swamp, guided only by the faint glow of the green mist rising from the water. The other witches watched from the edge of the marsh, silent and unmoving, while the initiate stepped deeper into the dark pools. And fear was part of the trial. The witches believed that fear revealed the true strength of the mind. An initiate who allowed fear to control her would never master the magic of Dathomir. But an initiate who could move forward despite that fear had already taken the first step toward becoming a true Nightsister. When the initiate finally reached the deeper waters, she called upon the magic she had been learning since childhood. The chants echoed softly through the swamp, and the green mist began to gather around her hands. Then she waited. The sleeper always responded to the disturbance. The creature moved slowly beneath the water, drawn toward the energy of the ritual. The surface of the swamp would ripple as its massive form approached from below. Sometimes the initiate could see only a shadow moving through the dark water. Sometimes she felt nothing at all until the moment it struck. The purpose of the trial was not to defeat the creature, it was to survive it. Each initiate had to take something from the sleeper, a scale, a fragment of bone, or any piece of its ancient body, and return safely to the coven. The remains would later be used in sacred rituals, ground into ingredients for potions and spells. But reaching the creature meant facing the full danger of Dathomir's wild power. Many initiates failed. Some lost control of their magic when the sleeper rose beneath them. Others allowed panic to overwhelm their training. When that happened, the creature dragged them beneath the swamp, disappearing into the dark waters before the coven could intervene. The witches did not attempt rescue. The trial existed for a reason. And if an initiate could not survive the sleeper, she could not survive the deeper magics of the covens. But those who succeeded returned changed. When an initiate stepped out of the swamp carrying a piece of the creature, the other witches welcomed her as one of their own. The clan mothers would take the remains she had gathered and use them to create a sacred mixture known as the Water of Life. This substance became a powerful tool within Nightsister rituals, strengthening their spells and deepening their connection to the Ichor flowing beneath the planet. For the initiates who passed the trial, the experience left a permanent mark. They had faced the living heart of Dathomir and survived. From that moment forward, they were no longer simply students of magic. They were witches of the coven, and the power waiting for them would only grow stronger. As the generations passed, the covens of Dathomir became more than groups of witches practicing rituals in the swamps. They became a society. The harsh world around them demanded order, and the witches understood that their growing power needed guidance. Without leadership, the magic of the covens could easily turn destructive. Too many witches pulling from the Ichor without balance could tear apart the fragile harmony that allowed them to survive on Dathomir. So the covens placed their trust in the strongest among them. These leaders became known as clan mothers. A clan mother was not chosen through bloodline alone. She was chosen through strength, experience, and wisdom. The witches believed that only someone who truly understood the nature of Dathomir's power could guide the coven safely. The process of becoming a clan mother was rarely peaceful. Within each coven, powerful witches sometimes challenged the authority of the current leader. These challenges were not always fought with weapons. Often they took the form of ritual contests, where two witches tested their control over the Ichor in front of the entire coven. The outcome determined leadership. Whoever demonstrated greater mastery of magic earned the right to lead. This system ensured that the most capable witches stood at the top of the coven's hierarchy. The clan mothers were responsible for protecting their people, teaching the initiates, and guarding the sacred knowledge written within the Book of Law. They also held another responsibility, and they were the keepers of memory. Every clan mother carried the history of the coven within her teachings. Stories of past trials, lost witches, and ancient rituals were passed carefully from one generation to the next. The witches believed that forgetting the past would weaken their connection to the planet. And on Dathomir, weakness could be fatal. Under the guidance of the clan mothers, the society of the witches became clearly structured. At the top stood the clan mother herself, surrounded by the most experienced witches known as acolytes. These women had already passed the trials of the swamp. and mastered the use of Ichor in complex rituals. Below them were the initiates, young witches still learning how to control their magic. The structure allowed the covens to grow stronger with each generation. But the witches of Dathomir did not live alone on their world. Beyond the swamps and ritual grounds lived the male inhabitants of the planet. These warriors became known as the Night Brothers. Unlike the witches, the Night Brothers did not practice magic. Their role within the society of Dathomir was different. They served the covens. The Night Brothers protected the territory around the witches' villages and acted as warriors during conflicts with other tribes. Some were also chosen by the clan mothers to strengthen the bloodlines of the covens. But the Night Brothers never held authority over the witches. Dathomir was ruled by its daughters. This matriarchal order shaped every part of their culture. The witches controlled the rituals, the teachings, and the decisions that affected the entire world. Their power came not only from magic, but from unity. They trusted the coven above all else. Over time, the influence of the clan mothers spread across the forests and swamps of the planet. Separate covens developed their own traditions, but they all followed the same fundamental principles passed down from Allya's teachings. Protect the coven. Respect the power of the Ichor. Trust no one beyond Dathomir. These beliefs formed the foundation of Night Sister society. Through them, the witches grew into one of the most unusual cultures the galaxy had ever known. A civilization built on magic. A civilization guided by powerful women. A civilization that thrived in the shadows of a forgotten world. For centuries, the Night Sisters continued to grow stronger beneath the red sky of Dathomir. But the wider galaxy was slowly changing. New powers were rising among the stars. And one day, those powers would discover the witches hidden within the swamps. When that moment came, the covens of Dathomir would face a future far more dangerous than anything their planet had ever prepared them for. There was a time when the witches of Dathomir feared no one. The swamps belonged to them. The forests answered to them. Even the massive beasts that roamed the wild lands had learned to recognize their presence. For centuries, after the teachings of Allya spread across the planet, the Night Sisters lived in near total isolation from the wider galaxy. The Republic did not travel near their world. Jedi explorers rarely ventured into the deep outer rim where Dathomir rested beneath its red sky. And so the covens grew stronger without interruption. The witches built their strongholds along the edges of the great swamps where the Ichor flowed closest to the surface. Stone fortresses rose slowly from the dark cliffs of the planet, shaped by hand and reinforced with bone and twisted roots from the ancient forests. These fortresses became the heart of each coven. Within their walls, the Night Sisters practiced their magic without fear of interference. Ritual chambers were carved into the stone, illuminated by the faint green glow of Ichor mist drifting through the air. The chants of witches echoed quietly through these halls during the long nights of Dathomir. Outside the strongholds, the land itself remained wild. Massive rancors roamed the forests freely, hunting through the shadows of the tall black trees. To most creatures in the galaxy, rancors were unstoppable predators. Their strength was enormous, and their temper even more dangerous. But the Night Sisters saw them differently. They saw opportunity. Through years of observation and ritual, the witches slowly learned how to approach the massive creatures without provoking their rage. Magic played a role in this bond, but so did patience and respect for the beasts that ruled the wilderness of Dathomir. Over time, the rancors accepted the witches. Some even allowed themselves to be guided. The first Night Sister, who climbed onto the back of one of these creatures, changed the balance of power across the planet forever. A rancor standing beside a witch became more than a beast. It became a weapon. Soon, the covens began raising rancors near their strongholds, training them from a young age so that they would recognize the witches as their masters. When the witches rode into the forests mounted on these enormous creatures, few living things dared challenge them. Dathomir had become their world completely. But the strength of the Nightsisters did not come only from their beasts or their fortresses. It came from their unity. The covens remained bound together through shared rituals and ancient traditions. Clan mothers met with one another during rare gatherings beneath the red sky, where they discussed matters that affected the entire planet. These meetings were quiet, careful events. No coven sought to dominate the others. They understood that division would weaken them all. Together, the witches maintained the balance of their world. The Night Brothers protected the outer territories. The covens guarded the sacred swamps where the Ichor flowed strongest, and the initiates continued their trials beneath the watchful eyes of the clan mothers. For the Nightsisters, life on Dathomir had reached a perfect rhythm. They had power, and they had control, and they had peace. Beyond their world, the galaxy moved through endless cycles of conflict. Wars between Jedi and Sith rose and fell across the centuries. Republic systems argued over trade routes and politics. But those struggles rarely touched the red world hidden deep within the Outer Rim. The Nightsisters watched the stars from their swamps without concern. Dathomir was theirs. And for a long time, no one dared challenge that truth. Strength on Dathomir was measured differently than on most worlds. In the Republic, strength often came from fleets, armies, or political power. On Dathomir, strength came from survival. The forests were unforgiving, the swamps were dangerous, and the creatures that lived there showed little mercy to those who wandered carelessly into their territory. Among those creatures, none were more feared than the Rancors. They moved through the forests like living mountains. Their massive bodies could tear through trees, and their claws were capable of crushing bone with ease. The Night Brothers, who hunted the wild lands of Dathomir, respected the Rancors as the most dangerous predators on the planet. Most hunters avoided them entirely. The Nightsisters did not. For generations, the witches had studied the behavior of these creatures. They understood that Rancors were not mindless beasts. They were intelligent, territorial, and deeply connected to the rhythm of the planet. The witches believed that the same energy flowing through the Ichor beneath Dathomir also touched the minds of these enormous animals. Because of this connection, the witches approached the Rancors with patience rather than force. Clan Mother, or skilled acolyte, would often travel deep into the forests alone, guided by magic and instinct. When she found a young Rancor, the witch would begin the slow process of earning the creature's trust. She used the green mist of Ichor to calm the beast's instincts, speaking quiet chants while the animal watched her carefully. The ritual could last many days. The witches never rushed it. If the Rancor accepted the presence of the witch, a bond slowly formed between them. The creature learned to recognize the witch's voice, her scent, and the subtle presence of her magic. Over time, the Rancor would begin following the witch back toward the coven's stronghold. Once the bond was established, the creature became something far more powerful than a wild predator. It became a mount. A Night Sister riding a Rancor was a sight few beings in the galaxy would ever forget. The massive creature moved through the forests with heavy, deliberate steps, while the witch guided it from above with quiet commands and gentle use of magic. Together, they were nearly unstoppable. The witches did not use their Rancors carelessly. These creatures were not simple tools to be thrown into battle. They were partners, guardians of the coven, who shared the harsh life of Dathomir. Many witches formed lifelong bonds with the Rancors they trained, treating them with respect and even a strange form of affection. But when danger came, those bonds became weapons. If rival tribes threatened the covens, the Nightsisters rode into battle atop their rancors. The ground shook beneath the creatures' weight as they charged through the forests, and their roars echoing across the swamps. Few enemies could stand against such power. The Night Brothers fought beside them during these conflicts, using traditional weapons while the witches commanded the battlefield with magic. Through these battles, the Nightsisters secured control over the wild lands of Dathomir. Other tribes eventually learned that challenging the covens meant facing forces far beyond their strength, and so the covens ruled. Their fortresses stood strong above the swamps. Their rancors guarded the forests. Their magic flowed through the air like a living shadow. The Nightsisters had become the dominant power on their world, but their greatest strength was not the beasts they rode or the spells they cast. It was the quiet understanding that Dathomir itself stood with them. The planet had shaped them, and they had learned how to shape it in return. Life on Dathomir followed a rhythm that outsiders would have struggled to understand. The red sky above the planet rarely changed. Thick clouds drifted slowly across the horizon, turning the light of day into a constant twilight. Even at noon, the forests remained dim, their tall black trees blocking most of the fading sunlight. For the Nightsisters, this world of shadow felt natural. They had never known anything else. Their strongholds stood at the edge of the great swamps, built from dark stone taken from the cliffs of Dathomir. These fortresses were not grand like the cities of the Republic. They were practical structures, shaped by the needs of the covens and the dangers of the planet around them. Inside the strongholds, life moved quietly. Initiates studied the rituals of magic under the watchful eyes of the acolytes. The chants of the covens echoed softly through the ritual chambers, mixing with the faint glow of Ichor mist drifting across the stone floors. The air carried the scent of herbs and oils used in potions brewed by the witches. These potions served many purposes. Some were medicines used to heal wounds suffered during the harsh trials of training. Others were poisons designed to weaken enemies should the covens ever face invasion. The witches of Dathomir understood that survival required preparation for both healing and destruction. Beyond the walls of the strongholds, the Night Brothers maintained their own settlements in the forests. They trained constantly as hunters and warriors, learning how to survive among the dangerous creatures that roamed the wild lands of the planet. Their relationship with the Nightsisters defined the structure of Dathomir's society. The witches ruled the covens and guided the rituals of magic. The Night Brothers served as protectors of the land, guarding the outer territories and defending the covens when conflict arose. Some Night Brothers were also chosen to strengthen the bloodlines of the witches, ensuring that future generations would continue to carry the sensitivity to the force that allowed them to wield magic. Despite this connection, the witches and Night Brothers lived separate lives. The Nightsisters remained within the covens, focused on their rituals and teachings. Their days were filled with training, gathering herbs from the forests, and preparing for the ceremonies that honored the ancient powers of Dathomir. Death was not feared among them. The witches believed death was simply another passage within the Force. When a Nightsister died, the coven performed a careful ritual to prepare her body for burial. Her remains were cleaned with fragrant oils and wrapped in cloth that had been washed in magical water. The coven would then place her body within a burial pod made from animal skins and decorated with bones and shells. These pods were hung from structures built from twisted branches, forming graveyards that resembled the strange plants growing throughout the forests of Dathomir. The witches believed the spirits of their dead sisters remained near these resting places. Sometimes during powerful rituals, the covens even called upon those spirits for guidance. Outsiders such traditions would have seemed unsettling. To the Nightsisters, they were simply another part of life. Under the red sky of Dathomir, the boundary between the living and the dead had always felt thin. The witches respected that boundary, but they were never afraid to cross it. And as long as the covens remained united, life beneath the red sky continued in quiet strength. For the Nightsisters, this was their world, and they believed it always would be. For many centuries, the witches of Dathomir believed their world had reached its natural balance. The covens ruled the swamps and forests without challenge. Their rituals continued beneath the red sky just as they had since the days of Allya. Each new generation of initiates learned the same chants, faced the same trials, and inherited the same connection to the Ichor flowing beneath the planet. It was a quiet era, not one defined by conquest or expansion, but by stability. The witches did not seek to build empires across the stars. They had no fleets, no desire to leave their world behind, and no interest in the politics of the Republic. Their power existed only for the survival of the covens and the protection of Dathomir itself. And in this isolation, their society flourished. The clan mothers maintained careful communication between the different covens spread across the planet. Though each coven had its own traditions and sacred sites, they all followed the same teachings left behind in the Book of Law. These teachings ensured that the witches remained united despite the distance between their strongholds. Unity was their greatest strength. So when one coven required assistance, others answered without hesitation. If a dangerous creature threatened a sacred swamp, witches from neighboring fortresses would ride together on rancors to drive the beast away. When initiates gathered for their trials, elders from multiple covens sometimes watched in silence, observing the future generation of their order. These gatherings strengthened the bonds between the witches. They reminded every Nightsister that she belonged to something larger than her own coven. She belonged to the lineage of Dathomir. During this time, the knowledge of Nightsister magic continued to grow. Some clan mothers discovered new rituals capable of shaping the Ichor into powerful enchantments. Warriors could be strengthened before battle, and their bodies filled with unnatural endurance and rage drawn from the dark currents of the planet. Other witches explored the spiritual side of their magic. They learned how to speak with the lingering spirits of fallen sisters, calling them back through the veil that separated life from death. These spirits did not always remain long, but the guidance they offered sometimes revealed forgotten knowledge or warnings about dangers approaching the covens. The witches believed this connection to their ancestors made them stronger. The past remained alive among them. Even the creatures of Dathomir seemed to recognize the growing harmony between the witches and their world. The Rancors continued to serve as loyal guardians of the covens. Smaller creatures avoided the sacred ritual grounds where the witches practiced their magic. Yet it was as though the entire planet had accepted the Nightsisters as its keepers. This long period of stability would later be remembered by many witches as the golden age of the coven. It was a time when their power remained unquestioned, and their traditions remained unchallenged by outside forces. But history rarely allows peace to last forever. Beyond the distant stars, the galaxy continued to change. New powers rose and fell among the Republic and the Sith. Wars reshaped entire systems, and explorers slowly pushed further into the Outer Rim. One day, those distant movements would reach the quiet world of Dathomir. When that moment arrived, the witches would discover that isolation could not protect them forever. For now, however, the Nightsisters remained unaware of what the future would bring, and they continued their rituals beneath the red sky. They trained their daughters in the ancient magics of the covens. and they believed that the strength of Dathomir would always remain their shield. But the Force often carries strange currents across the galaxy, and somewhere beyond their world, a new chapter in the history of the Nightsisters was already beginning to take shape. Time eventually changes every order. For centuries, the covens of Dathomir had lived in balance with one another. Their rituals continued beneath the red sky, their rancors guarded the forests, and their traditions passed quietly from one generation of witches to the next. The Nightsisters believed their society would continue this way forever. But even on Dathomir, peace was fragile. As the centuries passed, the covens slowly began to drift apart. Each clan mother guided her witches according to her own vision. Some covens focused on mastering the spiritual side of magic, speaking with the spirits that lingered near the swamps. Others explored more aggressive rituals, discovering new ways to strengthen warriors or bend living minds. At first, these differences were small, but over time, they grew. The witches still respected one another, yet the unity that once defined the Nightsisters began to weaken. Rivalries formed between covens who believed their traditions were stronger or more important than the others. Disagreements over sacred territories sometimes turned into quiet conflicts in the forests. The covens had always believed division would weaken them, and slowly, that fear began to feel real. It was during this uncertain time that a new figure began to rise among the witches. Her name was Talzin. Unlike many witches of Dathomir, Talzin possessed an unusual awareness of the wider galaxy beyond her world. While most Nightsisters focused only on the survival of their covens, Talzin believed their future depended on something greater. Unity. Talzin had grown up studying the deepest magics of the covens. From an early age, her connection to the Ichor flowing beneath Dathomir had been unusually strong. The green mist obeyed her voice easily, twisting into shapes that other witches struggled to control. But her greatest strength was not simply her magic, it was her patience. Talzin understood something the other clan mothers had begun to forget. The covens could not afford to remain divided. Dathomir was powerful, but the galaxy beyond their world was even greater. If outside forces ever discovered the full strength of Nightsister magic, scattered covens would not be able to defend themselves. They needed to stand together. Talzin began traveling between the strongholds of the different covens, speaking quietly with the clan mothers. She did not threaten them or challenge their authority. Instead, as she reminded them of the teachings that had guided the witches since the time of Allya. Protect the coven. Respect the power of Dathomir. Stand united against those who would seek to control them. Her words slowly began to take hold. One by one, the clan mothers agreed to set aside their rivalries. Under Talzin's influence, the covens began strengthening their bonds again. Ritual gatherings between witches from different strongholds became more frequent. Knowledge once guarded by individual covens was shared more openly among them. Talzin did not demand leadership, but the witches began to look to her for guidance. Her understanding of magic was unmatched. Her vision for the future of the Nightsisters was clear, and her ability to unite the covens gave the witches something they had nearly lost: purpose. Eventually, the covens recognized what had already become true. Talzin had become their leader. She was given the title that would define her place in Nightsister history: Mother Talzin. Under her rule, the scattered covens of Dathomir became something far more powerful than they had ever been before. The witches no longer acted as separate groups guarding their own territories. They had become a single order, an order guided by one voice. But Talzin's vision for the Nightsisters did not end with unity, because while most witches still watched the red sky of Dathomir, Talzin had already begun looking toward the stars. And beyond those stars, a new shadow was rising within the galaxy, a shadow that would soon cross paths with the mother of the Nightsisters. Talzin did not become the leader of the Nightsisters through a single moment of victory. And her rise was quiet, patient, almost invisible to those who did not understand the deeper currents of Dathomir. By the time the covens began calling her Mother Talzin, the transformation had already taken place. The witches simply recognized what had been true for many years. Talzin understood their world better than anyone else. Her connection to the magic of Dathomir was extraordinary. During rituals, the green Ichor mist responded to her voice with unusual strength. Spells that required several witches working together could sometimes be performed by Talzin alone, but raw power was only part of her reputation. Talzin possessed something rarer among the witches of Dathomir: vision. Most clan mothers focused only on the protection of their coven and the survival of their traditions. Talzin believed the Nightsisters were meant for something greater than simple survival. They were meant to shape the future of their world. Under her leadership, the covens began expanding their understanding of Nightsister magic. Rituals once performed only within the sacred swamps were refined and strengthened. New potions and enchantments were created within the chambers of the covens. Some of these rituals were meant to heal, others were meant to destroy. Talzin encouraged both. She believed that true strength came from understanding every aspect of the power flowing beneath Dathomir. The Ichor was not simply a tool for defense. It could reshape living bodies, cloud the minds of enemies, and even twist the boundary between life and death. The witches followed her teachings with careful respect. Talzin never demanded obedience through fear. Instead, she guided the covens through demonstration. When a ritual failed, she showed them how it could be corrected. When a witch struggled to control the green mist, Talzin stood beside her until the magic responded. Through this quiet leadership, the covens became stronger than they had ever been. The witches also began exploring deeper parts of their world under Talzin's direction. Dathomir contained many ancient places that earlier covens had avoided, believing them to be too dangerous or unstable. Talzin believed those fears were limiting the true potential of Nightsister power. So she led expeditions into forgotten caves and hidden swamps. In those dark places, the witches discovered new veins of Ichor flowing beneath the surface of the planet. So some of these places carried energy far stronger than the ritual grounds they had used for generations. Talzin turned these locations into new sanctuaries of magic. The witches gathered there during powerful ceremonies, drawing enormous waves of green mist from the earth itself. These rituals strengthened the connection between the covens and the living energy of Dathomir. The Nightsisters were no longer simply practitioners of magic. They had become masters of it. But Talzin's growing power did not come without sacrifice. During this period of change, she also experienced loss within her own life. Talzin had children, including a son who carried strong potential within the Force. Like many Nightsisters, she believed her children would one day serve the covens and protect the future of Dathomir. But the galaxy beyond their world was beginning to stir. Unknown to most witches, powerful figures had already begun sensing the strange energy flowing from the Nightsisters' homeworld. Among those watching from the shadows was a Sith Lord who believed the power of Dathomir might serve his own ambitions. Talzin had not yet met him, but the currents of the Force were slowly guiding their paths toward one another. For now, the covens continued to grow stronger beneath her rule. Mother Talzin stood at the center of that strength, guiding the witches through what many would later remember as the height of their power. But even the greatest power can attract dangerous attention. And somewhere far beyond the red sky of Dathomir, a dark voice had begun to listen. Far beyond the swamps of Dathomir, the galaxy moved through shadows of its own, and the Republic still believed it stood in a time of fragile peace. The Jedi Order guarded the galaxy as it had for generations, teaching its students the ancient balance of the Force and watching carefully for signs of the dark side's return. But the dark side had never truly disappeared. It had only grown quieter. Hidden among the powerful figures of the Republic was a Sith Lord who had mastered the art of patience. He moved through the political world under a different name, concealing his true identity even from the Jedi who served beside him. His name in the shadows was Darth Sidious. The Sith had followed the rule of two for many generations. Only a master and an apprentice could exist at one time, preserving their power in secrecy until the moment came to challenge the Jedi openly. As Sidious understood this rule better than anyone before him, but he also understood something else. Power could be borrowed. Across the galaxy, he searched for sources of strength that could help him shape the future he desired. Ancient Sith temples, forgotten holocrons, and hidden Force traditions all drew his attention. And eventually, the currents of the Force led him to a distant world in the Outer Rim, Dathomir. At first, Sidious knew little about the witches who lived there. Reports from explorers and scattered rumors described strange rituals performed in the swamps, women who commanded beasts and summoned green fire from the earth. Most people dismissed those stories as superstition. Sidious did not. He recognized something familiar within those whispers. The power described in those rumors carried the same dark currents that fueled the Sith. But the witches of Dathomir did not follow the teachings of the Sith Order. Their magic came from somewhere older, somewhere unique. Sidious became curious. Through quiet investigation and secret observation, he began studying the traditions of the Nightsisters. He learned about their connection to the Ichor flowing beneath the planet. He learned about the covens and the powerful clan mothers who ruled them. And eventually, he learned about their leader, Mother Talzin. Even from a distance, Sidious could sense her presence through the Force. Talzin's connection to the dark currents of Dathomir was unlike anything he had encountered before. Her magic did not resemble the techniques taught within Sith temples. It was raw, ancient, wild, and that made it valuable. Sidious understood that such power could not be controlled easily. The Nightsisters were independent, proud of their traditions, and fiercely loyal to their own kind. Attempting to conquer them would likely provoke resistance. But Sidious had never relied on brute force. He preferred manipulation. If Talzin believed an alliance with him would strengthen the Nightsisters, she might accept his presence willingly. And if that alliance allowed Sidious to learn the secrets of Nightsister magic, he could add that knowledge to the arsenal of the Sith. The plan formed slowly within his mind. He would not approach Dathomir as an enemy. He would arrive as a partner. Through the Force, Sidious reached out carefully across the vast distance between their worlds. As his presence moved like a shadow through the currents of the dark side, searching for the mind of the woman who ruled the covens, Talzin felt it, in the ritual chambers of Dathomir, surrounded by swirling green mist. She sensed a new presence touching the edges of her awareness. It was distant, powerful, and filled with ambition. For a moment, the Ichor around her stirred. Talzin understood immediately that this presence did not belong to the witches of her world. Someone beyond Dathomir had begun searching for her, and that someone carried the power of the Sith. The first contact between Mother Talzin and the Sith Lord did not happen with ships or armies. It happened in silence. Far across the galaxy, Darth Sidious reached through the dark side of the Force, allowing his presence to drift slowly toward the world of Dathomir. And it was not an attack or a command. It was something quieter, an invitation. Talzin felt it the moment it touched the swamps of her world. She was standing within the ritual chamber of her coven, surrounded by the faint green glow of Ichor rising from the stone floor. The other witches had already left the chamber, their chants fading into the night beyond the fortress walls. But Talzin remained still. The force had shifted. The presence she felt was unfamiliar, yet powerful. It carried the same dark currents the witches drew upon during their rituals, but it was shaped differently. The power behind it was disciplined, controlled in ways that reminded Talzin of the ancient teachings left behind by Allya. The power of the Sith. Talzin did not fear it. Instead, she listened. Through the quiet connection of the Force, Sidious revealed himself slowly. He did not speak aloud. His thoughts moved like shadows across the distance between them, carrying fragments of intention rather than direct words. He had come seeking knowledge. He believed the magic of the Nightsisters could strengthen the future he was preparing for the galaxy. The Sith had spent generations hiding from the Jedi, building their strength in secret while waiting for the right moment to strike. Sidious believed Talzin understood secrecy. He believed she understood patience. And most importantly, he believed she understood power. Talzin considered his presence carefully. She had spent her life protecting the covens of Dathomir from outside influence. The teachings of the Book of Law warned the witches to distrust those beyond their world, especially the Jedi who once exiled Allya. But the Sith were not the Jedi. The Jedi feared the dark side. The Sith embraced it. Talzin recognized an opportunity. If the Sith Lord truly wished to learn from the Nightsisters, then the witches might also learn from him. Knowledge flowed both ways in any alliance. The magic of Dathomir was powerful, but the Sith possessed their own ancient traditions that stretched back through thousands of years of conflict with the Jedi. Together, their power could grow. So Talzin accepted the connection. The alliance that formed between them remained hidden from the rest of the galaxy. Sidious never arrived on Dathomir openly. Instead, the two shared knowledge through secret meetings guided by the Force itself. Talzin taught him the nature of the Ichor flowing beneath her world. She showed him how the witches shaped magic through ritual, emotion, and connection to the living energy of the planet. In return, Sidious shared fragments of Sith teachings that had been preserved within ancient holocrons. The exchange strengthened them both. But Talzin was not naive. She understood the Sith well enough to know that their alliances rarely lasted forever. The rule of two demanded that Sith masters and apprentices eventually betray one another in their pursuit of ultimate power. If the Sith could betray their own kind, they could certainly betray the Nightsisters. For now, however, the alliance served its purpose. Talzin continued guiding the covens of Dathomir into a new era of strength. Sidious continued building the influence he would one day use to reshape the Republic itself. Their paths had crossed through the currents of the dark side. And though neither of them fully trusted the other, both believed the partnership would help them achieve their ambitions. But hidden within that alliance was a choice that would change the future of the Nightsisters forever. Because the Sith Lord who studied Talzin's power had also begun watching something else. Her son. And in time, that child would be taken from Dathomir and trained as a weapon of the Sith. The galaxy would one day know him by another name, Darth Maul. Talzin had always believed the power of Dathomir would shape the future of the Nightsisters. But she never imagined that the future would begin with the loss of her own child. Among the witches of the covens, family was different from the traditions of the Republic. The Nightsisters lived as a collective order. Children born among them belonged to the coven as much as they belonged to their mothers. Young witches were trained together, raised by the guidance of the clan mothers and the acolytes who served them. But Talzin's son was different. From the moment he was born, the witches sensed something unusual within him. The force moved strongly through the child, stronger than most children born on Dathomir. Even before he could walk, the currents of the dark side stirred around him like quiet echoes of a future not yet written. Talzin watched him carefully. She knew that strength could become either a blessing or a danger. On Dathomir, children who carried strong connections to the Force often became powerful witches or warriors of the covens. Talzin believed her son would one day protect the future of their people, but the galaxy beyond their world was already watching. Darth Sidious had continued his secret alliance with Talzin, studying the strange magics of the Nightsisters, while sharing fragments of Sith knowledge in return. Their partnership had been built on careful balance. Each understood that the other possessed power worth learning from. Yet Sidious was never satisfied with knowledge alone. The Sith always sought apprentices, and when Sidious sensed the strength growing within Talzin's son, he saw an opportunity that could not be ignored. The boy's potential was extraordinary. Even among Force-sensitive children, the dark side responded to him with unusual intensity. Sidious believed the child could become the perfect weapon for the future he was preparing. A weapon trained in secrecy, a weapon hidden from the Jedi. But taking the child from Dathomir would not be easy. Talzin was powerful, and the Nightsisters were fiercely protective of their own. Sidious could not simply arrive on the planet and claim the boy by force. Such an action would destroy the fragile alliance he had built with the covens. So he used deception. Sidious approached Talzin with promises carefully shaped to appeal to her ambitions. He spoke of a greater future for the Nightsisters, and a future where their power could influence the galaxy far beyond the swamps of Dathomir. If the Sith and the witches worked together, their combined strength could rival the Jedi themselves. Talzin listened. She understood the value of alliances. The Sith carried knowledge of the dark side that even the covens had never fully explored. An apprentice trained under both Sith discipline and Nightsister magic could become a powerful bridge between their traditions. Sidious offered to train the child himself. At first, Talzin believed the offer would strengthen the Nightsisters, but the Sith had never intended to share power. The moment the child left Dathomir, the alliance between Talzin and Sidious quietly changed. The boy was taken far from the swamps of his homeworld and brought into the hidden training grounds of the Sith. There, he would be shaped into something entirely different. The child who had once been Talzin's son slowly disappeared into the teachings of the dark side. His training was brutal, designed to strip away every weakness and replace it with rage, discipline, and obedience. The boy learned to fight before he learned to rest. He learned to hate before he learned to trust. And over time, the name he had once carried on Dathomir faded into silence. In its place, the Sith gave him a new identity, a name that would one day echo across the galaxy: Darth Maul. The boy who left Dathomir did not return as the same child. Under the watchful control of Darth Sidious, the one who would become Maul grew up in a world far colder than the swamps of his birth. There were no covens, no sisters, no familiar chants echoing through the night. There was only training. Sidious did not raise apprentices the way the Nightsisters raised their daughters. The Sith believed weakness had to be destroyed before true power could emerge. Every lesson Maul received was designed to strip away hesitation and replace it with absolute obedience to the dark side. His childhood became a series of trials. Pain was one of his earliest teachers. Sidious pushed the young boy through endless combat exercises, forcing him to face enemies stronger than himself again and again. Each failure brought punishment. Each victory brought harsher tests waiting just beyond it. But Maul did not break. The darkness within him grew stronger with every passing year. His connection to the Force deepened, and the rage that Sidious encouraged inside him became a weapon sharper than any blade. And while the Jedi trained their students to control emotion, the Sith trained Maul to embrace it. Hatred became his focus. Anger became his strength. And the memory of the world he had once known slowly faded beneath layers of discipline and violence. Sidious rarely showed approval. Praise was not part of the Sith method. Instead, the master watched his apprentice with cold patience, shaping him into the perfect instrument of the Sith's hidden plan. Maul learned more than combat. Sidious taught him the deeper philosophy of the dark side. The galaxy, he explained, was built on weakness. The Jedi believed in balance and restraint, but the Sith believed power belonged to those strong enough to seize it. Maul absorbed these teachings without question. He had no other life to remember, yet somewhere deep within him, fragments of the past remained. The swamps of Dathomir, the distant presence of his mother, and the strange magics of the covens lingered like half-forgotten dreams. Sidious had not erased those memories completely. In some ways, he had encouraged them. The Sith understood that pain created strength. The knowledge that Maul had been taken from his home fueled the anger that drove him forward. Every strike of his blade carried the weight of a life stolen before he could understand it. By the time Maul reached adulthood, he had become something far beyond an ordinary warrior. His body moved with unnatural speed and precision. His mind remained focused entirely on the will of his master. The dark side flowed through him like a storm waiting to be unleashed. But for many years, the galaxy did not know he existed. The Sith were still hidden. Sidious continued building his influence within the Republic, quietly preparing the moment when the Jedi Order would finally face its destruction. Until that moment arrived, Maul remained a secret weapon, a shadow moving through the dark. When Sidious required information, Maul gathered it. When enemies needed to disappear quietly, Maul carried out the task without hesitation. His movements across the galaxy left almost no trace, and those who encountered him rarely survived long enough to tell their story. Yet even as Maul served the Sith, the Nightsisters continued their own path on Dathomir. Mother Talzin knew what had truly happened when Sidious took her son. The alliance between them had not been equal. The Sith Lord had used deception to claim the child for himself. Talzin never forgot that betrayal, but she remained patient. So because the currents of the Force were always moving. And somewhere within those currents, the fate of her son, now known as Darth Maul, would eventually return to the world where his story began. While Darth Maul was being shaped into a weapon of the Sith, the Nightsisters of Dathomir continued their own quiet work in the shadows of the galaxy. Mother Talzin never allowed the loss of her son to weaken the covens. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. She understood now that the galaxy beyond Dathomir was far more dangerous than the witches had once believed. Powerful forces were moving among the stars, and the Nightsisters could not remain completely isolated forever. So Talzin began adapting. Instead of sending armies into the galaxy, the witches relied on something far more subtle: individuals. And the covens occasionally accepted outsiders into their ranks, especially those who had nowhere else to go. Some arrived on Dathomir as children, abandoned or captured by slavers before finding their way into the swamps. Others came seeking knowledge of magic, believing the legends whispered across the outer rim. Few of them understood the cost of that knowledge. Among these outsiders was a young girl who would one day become one of the most feared assassins in the galaxy. Her name was Asajj Ventress. Ventress did not begin her life on Dathomir. She was born on the world of Dathomirian origin, but her childhood was shaped by hardship and loss. Over time, Her path led her through several masters and battles before she finally returned to the world of the Nightsisters. When she arrived, she was already dangerous. Talzin recognized that danger immediately. Ventress carried the same fierce connection to the dark side that many witches of Dathomir possessed. She had known betrayal, pain, and anger, emotions the Nightsisters believed could sharpen a warrior's focus. Under Talzin's guidance, Ventress found a new purpose. The witches trained her within the rituals of the covens, teaching her how to channel the strange magics flowing beneath the planet. Though she was not born within the traditional Nightsister order, she quickly proved capable of learning their ways. Ventress became something unusual, part Nightsister, part assassin. Talzin understood the value of such a warrior. The Nightsisters did not wish to conquer the galaxy, but they were willing to influence it when necessary. Wealthy individuals, criminal organizations, and powerful figures sometimes sought the services of the witches for tasks that required discretion. Ventress became one of those tools. When someone needed an enemy removed quietly, the Nightsisters could offer an assassin trained in both combat and dark side techniques. Ventress moved through the galaxy with deadly efficiency, carrying out missions that strengthened the coven's influence far beyond the swamps of Dathomir. Yet Talzin always maintained control. Ventress remained loyal to the Nightsisters because she had finally found a place where her strength was respected rather than feared. For the first time in her life, she belonged to something greater than herself. But the galaxy was moving toward war. Asajj Ventress eventually came to the attention of a powerful figure within the separatist movement. And that figure was another Sith apprentice serving under Darth Sidious. His name was Count Dooku. Dooku recognized the same potential in Ventress that Talzin had seen years earlier. He believed she could serve as his own apprentice, a weapon to help the separatists fight against the Republic and the Jedi. Talzin allowed the arrangement to happen. On the surface, it appeared that the Nightsisters were lending their warrior to the separatist cause. But Talzin had her own plans. Every alliance in the galaxy carried hidden motives, and the witches of Dathomir had never forgotten the lesson of betrayal taught by Darth Sidious. If the Sith believed they could use the Nightsisters as tools, the Nightsisters were more than willing to return the favor. The galaxy was slowly moving toward conflict. For many years, tensions had been building between the Republic and the growing separatist movement. Political disputes turned into secret alliances, and powerful leaders across the galaxy began preparing for a war that most citizens did not yet understand. From the swamps of Dathomir, the Nightsisters watched these events with careful patience. Mother Talzin understood something that many others did not. War created opportunity. The witches had never been interested in controlling the galaxy, but they understood how chaos could reshape power. As conflict spread, powerful individuals would search for allies, weapons, and knowledge that might give them an advantage. The Nightsisters possessed all three. Through Asajj Ventress, their influence quietly reached into the growing struggle between the Republic and the separatists. Ventress served Count Dooku as a deadly enforcer, hunting Jedi and carrying out missions that strengthened the separatist cause. But Ventress was never truly one of the Sith. She remained connected to the Nightsisters. Talzin observed everything from Dathomir. Through rituals of magic and deep meditation within the Ichor-rich swamps, she followed the events unfolding across the galaxy. The green mist rising from the ground carried whispers of distant battles and shifting alliances. The war had not yet begun, but its shadow was already stretching across the stars. And at the center of that shadow stood the Sith. Darth Sidious continued shaping the future of the Republic from behind the mask of a politician. His apprentice, Count Dooku, built the separatist armies that would soon challenge the Jedi Order. And somewhere within the dark machinery of this growing conflict moved the warrior Sidious had once taken from Dathomir, Darth Maul. Though Maul had already carried out missions for his master across the galaxy, his true purpose had not yet been revealed. Sidious had trained him for something greater than simple assassination. Maul was meant to announce the return of the Sith. For generations, the Sith had hidden themselves from the Jedi, following the rule of two in secrecy while waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment was approaching, and when it came, Maul would stand at the front of it. For Mother Talzin, the coming war carried a different meaning. She had lost her son to the Sith many years earlier. Sidious had taken the child from Dathomir under the promise of shared power, and only to reshape him into something loyal only to the dark side. Talzin never forgot that betrayal, but she also understood the strange balance of the Force. The currents that carried Maul away from Dathomir might one day carry him back. For now, the witches prepared. The covens strengthened their rituals and continued training new initiates beneath the red sky. The Night Brothers guarded the forests, and the Rancors remained watchful along the edges of the swamps. Dathomir itself seemed to sense the coming storm. The Ichor beneath the planet pulsed more strongly during rituals, as if responding to the growing darkness spreading through the galaxy. The witches could feel the tension in the Force, the quiet pressure building before the outbreak of something much larger. War was coming, and when it finally arrived, the Nightsisters would not remain untouched by it. The conflict between the Republic and the separatists would reach even the hidden swamps of Dathomir. Old alliances would break, new enemies would rise, and the power of the covens would be tested in ways they had never faced before. The children shaped by this era would carry the scars of that war for the rest of their lives. Some would become assassins, some would become warriors, and some would become monsters. Because the galaxy was entering a time when survival demanded more than power. It demanded sacrifice. War rarely begins with a single battle. It begins with decisions. When the Clone Wars finally erupted across the galaxy, the Nightsisters of Dathomir did not rush to join the conflict. For centuries, they had remained hidden from the struggles of the Republic, watching distant wars rise and fall beyond the stars. But this war was different, because one of their own stood at its center. Asajj Ventress had become one of the most feared warriors serving Count Dooku and the Separatist Alliance. Under Dooku's command, she hunted Jedi across the galaxy, her twin red blades cutting through battlefields where the Republic and the Separatists clashed. To the Jedi, she was an assassin. To Dooku, she was a weapon. But to the Nightsisters, she was still one of their daughters. Mother Talzin had allowed Ventress to serve the Separatists for a reason. Through Ventress, the witches of Dathomir could observe the growing conflict between the Republic and the Sith without exposing their own world to danger. Ventress moved through the war like a shadow, gathering knowledge and influence that Talzin quietly studied from afar. For a time, the arrangement served both sides. Ventress carried out Dooku's commands with deadly efficiency. Jedi Knights fell to her blades, and entire battles shifted when she appeared among the Separatist forces. Her reputation grew quickly, spreading through both the Republic and the criminal underworld. But the Sith never trusted power they did not fully control. Darth Sidious had been watching Ventress for some time. Her growing strength in the dark side had begun attracting attention, and that attention made Sidious uneasy. The rule of two allowed only a master and an apprentice to exist among the Sith. Sidious was the master. Dooku was the apprentice. Ventress had become something dangerous. She was not officially a Sith, yet she carried the training and discipline of one. If she continued growing stronger, she might eventually challenge the structure of the Sith itself. Sidious could not allow that possibility, so he gave Dooku an order. Ventress had to die. Dooku did not hesitate. The betrayal came during what appeared to be an ordinary mission. Ventress was leading a separatist attack against a Republic fleet when Dooku suddenly turned against her. Without warning, his lightning struck across the battlefield, forcing Ventress to defend herself against the very master she had served. The assault was overwhelming. Dooku's power in the Force far exceeded hers, and he attacked without mercy. Ventress fought desperately to survive, but the outcome had already been decided. The Sith apprentice had been ordered to eliminate the assassin who had once served him. Her ship was destroyed during the battle. Ventress was thrown into the emptiness of space, her body drifting silently away from the burning wreckage. To the galaxy, it appeared that Asajj Ventress had died. But the Force had other plans. The Nightsisters felt the disturbance almost immediately. Far away on Dathomir, Mother Talzin sensed the violent ripple moving through the dark side. The Ichor beneath the swamp stirred as the covens gathered in their ritual chambers. Talzin understood what had happened. The Sith had betrayed one of their daughters. And on Dathomir, betrayal was never forgotten. So death had not claimed Asajj Ventress. When the battle ended and the wreckage of her ship drifted through the silent darkness of space, Ventress remained alive. Barely. Her body floated unconscious among the shattered fragments of metal and fire, carried slowly through the emptiness between stars. For a long time, she did not move, but fate had not finished with her. A group of scavengers eventually discovered the broken remains of her ship and brought her aboard their vessel. They knew little about the woman they had rescued. To them, she was simply another survivor pulled from the debris of the Clone Wars. But Ventress remembered everything. The betrayal, the lightning, the moment Count Dooku had decided she was no longer useful. The anger inside her grew stronger with every passing moment. When her strength returned, and Ventress left the scavengers behind and set her course for a single destination, Dathomir. The journey back to her homeworld was not an easy one. Ventress had spent years fighting across the galaxy, serving a master who had ultimately abandoned her. Now she returned not as a warrior of the separatists, but as something else entirely. A daughter seeking vengeance. When her ship finally descended through the red clouds of Dathomir, the world greeted her with the same dark silence it had always carried. The forests stretched endlessly beneath the crimson sky, and the swamps shimmered with faint green mist rising from the ground. Ventress stepped onto the soil of her home once again. The Nightsisters were already waiting. Mother Talzin had sensed her arrival long before the ship touched the surface, and the coven gathered within the stone fortress, their pale faces illuminated by the glow of Ichor drifting through the ritual chamber. Ventress entered quietly. For a moment, she said nothing. Talzin studied her carefully. The assassin who had once left Dathomir as a servant of the Sith now stood before them wounded, angry, and carrying the scars of betrayal. Talzin did not need to ask what had happened. The Force had already revealed the truth. Count Dooku had turned against her. Ventress spoke slowly as she described the battle, the lightning, and the moment she realized her master had chosen to destroy her rather than allow her to grow stronger. Her voice carried no fear, only rage. Talzin listened without interruption. When Ventress finished speaking, the chamber fell silent. The witches understood what this betrayal meant. The Sith had once taken Talzin's son and twisted him into Darth Maul. Now they had attempted to destroy another daughter of the coven. Talzin's eyes narrowed slightly as she considered the situation. The Sith had made their choice. Now the Nightsisters would make theirs. Talzin approached Ventress slowly, placing a hand upon her shoulder. The green mist of the ritual chamber moved gently around them, responding to the rising tension in the air. Ventress expected anger. She expected orders. Instead, Talzin offered something far more dangerous: revenge. The coven would help her destroy Count Dooku. But the Sith apprentice was powerful, far stronger than Ventress alone. If they wished to defeat him, they would need something capable of matching his strength in the dark side. Talzin already had a plan. So deep within the villages of the Night Brothers lived warriors chosen by the witches for breeding and battle. Among them were many who carried strong physical strength, but only a few possessed the potential required for Talzin's ritual. One of those warriors would soon become the instrument of their vengeance. His name was Asajj Opress, and before the ritual was complete, he would become something far more terrifying than the man he had once been. The witches of Dathomir did not rush their revenge. Mother Talzin understood that anger alone could not defeat a Sith. Count Dooku had been trained by the dark side for many years, guided by the teachings of Darth Sidious himself. Ventress had already faced him in battle once, and the outcome had nearly cost her life. If the Nightsisters wished to challenge Dooku again, and they needed something stronger, something he would not expect. Talzin's plan began in the villages of the Night Brothers. The Night Brothers lived separately from the covens, scattered among the forests and rocky plains of Dathomir. They were warriors and hunters, trained from childhood to survive the brutal environment of their world. Many of them served the witches in battle when necessary, but few were ever chosen for something greater. Talzin now searched among them for the strongest candidate. Ventress accompanied her as they entered the Night Brother village. The warriors gathered around them, wary but obedient. They knew better than to challenge the authority of the Nightsisters. Talzin began examining them carefully. She looked for strength, for discipline, for the kind of inner rage that could be shaped into a weapon. One by one, the warriors stepped forward as she studied them through the strange glow of Nightsister magic. Some were strong but lacked focus. Others carried too much fear beneath their strength. Then one figure stepped forward. He was larger than the others, his presence calm but powerful. His name was Asajj Opress, a warrior known among the Night Brothers for his skill and loyalty. Unlike many others, he did not boast about his strength. He simply carried it. Talzin watched him in silence. The Ichor swirling in the air around her began to move more strongly, as though the force itself had recognized the potential standing before her. She had found her instrument. Asajj was brought before the coven as night fell across Dathomir. The witches gathered within the ritual chamber, their pale faces illuminated by the green glow rising from the stone floor. Ventress stood beside Talzin, watching as the ritual began. Asajj did not fully understand what was about to happen, but he accepted it without resistance. Talzin raised her hands, and the chamber filled with swirling clouds of Ichor. The witches began chanting in low voices, their words echoing through the stone walls as the energy of the planet answered their call. The transformation began slowly. Green mist wrapped around Asajj's body, lifting him slightly from the ground as the ritual deepened. His muscles expanded, his bones shifting under the pressure of the magic flowing through him. Pain filled the chamber. Asajj screamed as the witches reshaped him into something stronger than any ordinary warrior. His body grew larger, and his strength multiplied by the dark energy of Dathomir. But Talzin was not finished. She reached deeper into the ritual, pouring more Ichor into the transformation. Asajj's mind began to change as well. The calm discipline he once carried was replaced by something darker. Rage, a burning hunger for violence that the witches carefully guided toward a single purpose: Count Dooku. When the ritual finally ended, Asajj Opress collapsed onto the stone floor of the chamber. The witches stepped back as the green mist slowly faded around him. The warrior who rose from the ground was no longer the man who had entered the chamber. His body towered above the other Night Brothers. His strength pulsed through every movement, and his mind carried only one command: serve the witches. Talzin approached him quietly. Asajj Savage knelt before her without hesitation. The weapon of their revenge was ready. All that remained was to deliver him to the man who had betrayed the Nightsisters. The plan was simple. Savage Opress would become the weapon that destroyed Count Dooku. Mother Talzin and the coven had reshaped the Night Brother into something far stronger than any ordinary warrior. His body now carried the strength of Nightsister magic, and the rage burning inside him had been carefully directed toward a single purpose: revenge. But Talzin understood that raw strength alone would not defeat a Sith Lord. Savage would need training. Ventress took on that task. Under her guidance, Savage began learning how to fight with the discipline required to face Dooku. His massive strength gave him a natural advantage, but Ventress taught him how to control it. And she showed him how to focus his anger, rather than allowing it to consume him completely. For a short time, the plan seemed possible. Savage traveled across the galaxy, carrying out missions that tested his growing power. Ventress observed his progress carefully, preparing him for the moment when he would face the Sith apprentice who had betrayed her. But the dark side is rarely predictable. The magic that had created Savage also awakened something dangerous within him. The ritual had amplified not only his strength, but also his aggression. The rage Talzin had planted inside his mind grew stronger with every battle he fought. Soon, controlling that rage became difficult. Savage began acting without orders, allowing his anger to guide his actions rather than the careful plans of the Nightsisters. Villages were destroyed, and enemies were slaughtered long after they had stopped fighting. Ventress saw the change immediately. The warrior she had helped create was becoming unstable. But by then, the path toward revenge had already begun. Savage eventually confronted Count Dooku, just as Talzin had intended. The battle that followed revealed the full extent of the Nightsisters' ritual. Savage fought with terrifying strength, pushing the Sith apprentice harder than Ventress ever had. For a moment, it seemed possible that the plan might succeed. But Dooku was still a master of the dark side. Using his greater experience, he turned Savage's rage against him. Rather than killing the warrior, Dooku chose something far more dangerous. He claimed him. The Sith apprentice began training Savage as his own tool, now reshaping the Nightsisters' creation into a servant of the dark side. The witches of Dathomir had intended Savage to destroy Dooku. Instead, he had become another weapon in the Sith's growing arsenal. When news of this reached Dathomir, Mother Talzin understood what had happened. Their attempt at revenge had failed. Worse still, their actions had drawn attention. Count Dooku had not forgotten the witches who had tried to kill him. Through his connection to Darth Sidious and the separatist armies, the Sith apprentice now possessed the power to strike back. The Nightsisters had awakened a conflict they could no longer control, and far away in the cold machinery of the separatist war effort, another figure listened carefully as Dooku described what the witches had done. General Grievous, and the cyborg commander of the separatist droid armies, had destroyed countless enemies across the galaxy. Entire planets had fallen under his brutal campaigns during the Clone Wars. Now, a new target had been placed before him: Dathomir. The witches who had ruled their world for centuries had finally drawn the attention of a war far greater than anything they had faced before, and soon, the armies of the separatists would arrive in the swamps of their home. The warning came too late. Far above the crimson clouds of Dathomir, warships began emerging from hyperspace one by one. Cold metal vessels of the separatist fleet drifted into orbit, their silhouettes cutting across the red glow of the planet below. Inside those ships waited an army, thousands of battle droids, transports, gunships. And at the center of it all stood the commander sent to destroy the witches of Dathomir, General Grievous. The cyborg general had already become a nightmare across the galaxy during the Clone Wars. Entire Republic fleets had fallen before his tactics, and countless Jedi had died beneath the spinning blades of his stolen lightsabers. Now his attention had turned toward a world that had remained hidden from most of the galaxy for centuries: Dathomir. Count Dooku had made the command very clear. The Nightsisters were to be wiped out. Their attempt to assassinate him through savage Opress had not gone unanswered. In the eyes of the separatists, the witches had interfered with the Sith's plans for the war. And interference carried consequences. As the fleet settled into orbit, the forests and swamps of Dathomir remained quiet beneath the blood-red sky. Creatures moved slowly through the mist-covered wetlands, unaware that a battle larger than anything their world had ever seen was about to begin. But the Nightsisters were not blind. Deep within their fortress, Mother Talzin felt the disturbance before the first droid transport ever touched the ground. The Ichor beneath the planet stirred violently, reacting to the sudden presence of thousands of machines descending toward the surface. The witches gathered quickly. Talzin stood within the ritual chamber as the coven formed a circle around her. The green mist swirled through the air, thick and restless, as the Nightsisters reached out through the Force to understand what approached their world. They saw metal armies, they saw fire, and they saw the shadow of the Sith behind it all. Talzin understood immediately. This was not a warning. This was extermination. Above the planet, the separatist transports began their descent through the red clouds. Engines roared as they cut through the atmosphere, carrying wave after wave of battle droids toward the swamps and forests below. General Grievous watched the planet silently from the command bridge of his ship. To him, this was just another campaign, another world to burn. But on Dathomir, and the witches had already begun preparing their answer. Because the Nightsisters did not run from war. They met it with magic. And before the night was over, the red skies of Dathomir would be filled with fire. The first droid transport slammed into the marshlands of Dathomir with mechanical precision. Ramps lowered, ranks of battle droids marched forward into the red fog. The swamp swallowed the sound of their metal footsteps as they advanced through twisted trees and pools of black water. Blaster rifles lifted in perfect synchronization, scanning the forests for movement. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the swamp answered. A green flash of energy erupted from the shadows, tearing through the front line of droids. Machines exploded into fragments as the first wave collapsed under a sudden storm of Nightsister magic. The witches had been waiting. Hidden among the trees and stone ridges, the covens launched their counterattack. Green Ichor spiraled through the air as the Nightsisters chanted ancient incantations, calling upon the dark power buried deep beneath their world. The swamp itself seemed to rise with them. Mist thickened across the battlefield as ghostly forms began to emerge from the shadows. Spirits twisted through the air like living storms, ripping through ranks of droids and sending shattered parts scattering into the mud. But the separatist army did not break. More transports landed. More droids poured into the swamps. The machines advanced without fear, without hesitation, firing endless waves of blaster fire into the forests where the witches moved. The battle quickly became chaos. Blaster bolts burned through the fog as Nightsisters fought with both magic and steel. Some carried energy bows that fired glowing bolts into the advancing droid ranks. Others summoned waves of Ichor that crushed machines beneath invisible pressure. Above the swamps, another roar echoed through the battlefield. Rancors, Massive beasts burst from the forests with Nightsisters riding on their backs. The creatures charged directly into the droid formations, tearing machines apart with claws the size of starship engines. For a moment, the separatist forces slowed, but the army attacking Dathomir was far larger than anything the witches had faced before. Droid gunships appeared above the battlefield, unleashing streams of fire that turned entire sections of forest into burning ruins. Rockets slammed into Rancors, sending the great beasts collapsing into the mud as explosions shook the swamps. Still, the witches fought. Talzin's coven summoned storm after storm of magic, refusing to surrender their world to the machines invading it. But even their power had limits. For every droid destroyed, 10 more stepped forward. And somewhere above the battlefield, watching the war unfold through the cold viewports of his warship, General Grievous prepared to enter the fight himself. The battle for Dathomir did not last long. The Nightsisters fought with everything they possessed: magic, beasts, and ancient rituals that had protected their world for generations. But the army sent by the separatists was built for one purpose: extermination. Wave after wave of battle droids flooded the swamps, pushing deeper toward the stone fortress where the covens had ruled for centuries. Blaster fire cut through the mist as the forests burned around them, turning the quiet marshlands into a battlefield of smoke and shattered trees. Still, the witches resisted. Green storms of Ichor tore through advancing droid formations. Spirits rose from the ground to strike the machines invading their world. Rancors roared as they charged into the metal ranks, crushing droids beneath their massive claws. But the enemy never stopped coming. Above the battlefield, another transport descended slowly through the smoke. The ramp opened. General Grievous stepped onto the surface of Dathomir. The cyborg commander moved through the burning swamp like a predator. His mechanical limbs carried him quickly across the battlefield as blaster fire flashed around him. Droid squads followed close behind, clearing a path through the witches still defending their home. Then Grievous reached the fortress. The Nightsisters guarding the entrance attacked immediately. Green magic erupted toward him, twisting through the air in violent spirals. But Grievous moved with unnatural speed, his mechanical body reacting faster than any living warrior. 4 lightsabers ignited at once. The blades spun through the fog like a storm of fire. Within seconds, the witches defending the fortress fell. Grievous continued forward without hesitation, cutting through the last lines of resistance as the droid army flooded into the fortress behind him. Blaster fire echoed through the ancient halls while the remaining Nightsisters fought desperately to protect their home. Many died where they stood, and others attempted to summon spirits to push the invaders back. But even their most powerful rituals could not stop the machines. The covens that had ruled Dathomir for centuries were collapsing. At the heart of the fortress, Mother Talzin watched the destruction unfold through the swirling mist of the ritual chamber. She understood the truth long before the battle ended. This was the end of the Nightsisters. One by one, the witches fell, the fortress burned, and the civilization that had once terrified the galaxy was being erased in a single night. When the battle ended, the swamps of Dathomir were silent. Smoke drifted slowly through the broken forests where the fighting had taken place. The red sky above the planet glowed faintly through the ashes of burned trees and shattered stone, and pools of dark water reflected the dying fires that still smoldered across the battlefield. The army of the separatists began its quiet withdrawal. Battle droids marched back toward their transports in perfect mechanical lines. Gunships lifted from the swamps, carrying the machines away from the destruction they had created. Above the planet, the fleet prepared to leave orbit, its mission complete. General Grievous did not look back. To him, Dathomir had been nothing more than another target, another world where resistance had been crushed beneath the endless armies of the separatists. But what remained behind was something far more tragic. The Nightsisters were gone. For centuries, the witches of Dathomir had lived in the shadows of the galaxy. They had built a civilization unlike any other, a society shaped by magic, survival, and the strange power flowing beneath their world. Now that civilization lay in ruins, the stone fortress had collapsed under fire and battle. The covens that once filled its halls had been scattered or destroyed. The rituals that had echoed through the swamps for generations had fallen silent. Only a few survivors remained. Some had escaped the battle by fleeing deeper into the forests before the droid armies reached them. Others vanished into the caves and hidden valleys scattered across the planet's wilderness. Among them were figures who would carry the memory of the Nightsisters long after the war ended. Asajj Ventress survived. Mother Talzin endured in a different way, her spirit slipping into the strange realm beyond the physical world where the magic of Dathomir still lingered. And somewhere within the ruins of the swamps, a young Nightsister named Merrin would grow up surrounded by the ghosts of her fallen sisters. The galaxy would soon forget what had happened here. The Clone Wars would continue spreading across thousands of systems, and the destruction of a hidden coven on a distant world would fade into the background of a much larger conflict. But Dathomir remembered. The Ichor beneath the planet still flowed through its depths. The spirits of the fallen witches still whispered through the fog. And though the Nightsisters had been nearly erased in a single night of fire and metal, their story was not yet finished. The war moved on quickly. Across the galaxy, the Clone Wars continued spreading through star systems and battlefields. Republic fleets clashed with separatist armadas. Jedi led clone armies into endless campaigns, and entire planets fell into chaos. In the middle of that storm, the destruction of the Nightsisters faded quietly into the background. For most of the galaxy, the witches of Dathomir had never truly existed. They were stories whispered in the outer rim, rumors about dark rituals and strange magics practiced on a distant swamp world. When the separatists burned their home, few people noticed, but one survivor remembered everything. Asajj Ventress. Ventress did not return to Dathomir after the massacre. The world she had once called home was now nothing more than ruins and ghosts, and the coven that had accepted her as a daughter had been shattered in a single night of war. Mother Talzin was gone, the fortress had fallen, and the sisters who had once fought beside her were scattered across the stars or lost forever in the swamps. For a long time, Ventress drifted through the galaxy without purpose. The anger she had carried for so many years had nowhere left to go. Count Dooku had betrayed her. The Nightsisters had been destroyed. Even the war itself felt distant, as if she no longer belonged to it. Eventually, Ventress chose a different path. She became a bounty hunter. The life suited her in ways she did not expect. Bounty hunters did not ask questions about the past. They did not care about lost civilizations or ancient covens buried beneath the ashes of war. They cared about survival. Ventress accepted contracts across the Outer Rim, hunting criminals, war profiteers, and fugitives who believed they could disappear into the chaos of the Clone Wars. Her reputation quickly returned, spreading through the underworld where her name was already known. But something inside her had changed. She no longer fought for revenge. She no longer served a master. For the first time in her life, Asajj Ventress was free. And yet the memories of Dathomir never truly left her. Sometimes, in quiet moments between missions, she could almost see the green glow of Ichor rising through the swamps. She could hear the low chants of the coven echoing through the fortress halls. The Nightsisters were gone. but their daughter still walked among the stars. The swamps of Dathomir did not forget. Long after the separatist fleet had vanished from the sky, the planet remained scarred by the battle that had nearly erased its people. Burned trees leaned over black water. The fortress of the Nightsisters stood broken, its ancient stones scattered across the marshland like bones. But the world was not completely empty. Hidden among the ruins was a child. Her name was Merrin. When the droid armies had descended upon Dathomir, Merrin had been very young, too young to fight, too young to fully understand the destruction unfolding around her. While the covens battled General Grievous and his machines, she had been hidden deep within the forests by the witches who still hoped to protect the next generation. They never returned. For many years, Merrin lived alone among the remains of her fallen civilization, and the forests and swamps that once belonged to the Nightsisters became her only companions. The broken fortress stood silent nearby, a reminder of the world that had been taken from her before she was old enough to remember it clearly. Yet Merrin was still a daughter of Dathomir. The power of the Nightsisters had not disappeared with the coven. The green Ichor still flowed beneath the planet's surface, whispering through the swamps like a quiet heartbeat. Merrin could feel it calling to her, guiding her through the strange magics her people had once practiced. She began teaching herself the ways of the witches. At first, the rituals came slowly. The spells she attempted were small and uncertain, echoes of knowledge passed down through instinct rather than instruction. But over time, Merrin grew stronger. The spirits of Dathomir seemed to answer her. Sometimes she could feel them watching from the mist. Other times she sensed the presence of the fallen witches who had died defending their world. Their voices were faint, like distant echoes carried through the force. But they reminded Merrin that she was not entirely alone. Still, the loneliness was heavy. The Nightsisters had once lived as a powerful civilization, a coven bound together by magic and survival. Now there was only one witch walking through the ruins of that lost society. Merrin grew up surrounded by ghosts, but the galaxy was still moving beyond the red sky of Dathomir. One day, strangers would arrive on her world again, and when they did, the last young witch of the Nightsisters would finally step beyond the ruins of her people and into a much larger destiny. The fall of the Nightsisters did not end their influence. Somewhere beyond the ruined swamps of Dathomir, another survivor carried the memory of the coven into a new age of the galaxy. Her name was Morgan Elspeth. Unlike many of the witches of Dathomir, Morgan had not been born within the traditional clans. She was human, an outsider who had become connected to the Nightsisters through their teachings and beliefs. Yet the destruction of their world affected her as deeply as it had the witches themselves. The massacre left something behind inside her: anger. As the Clone Wars came to an end, and the Republic transformed into the Galactic Empire, Morgan moved quietly through the changing galaxy. While many worlds struggled to survive under Imperial rule, she saw an opportunity: power. So Morgan began building influence within the Empire's growing military industry. She became known as a skilled magistrate and shipbuilder, someone capable of organizing massive production networks that supplied the Imperial fleet. But beneath that public image, another purpose guided her actions. She had not forgotten Dathomir. Every factory she built, every fleet she helped strengthen, was part of a long and patient plan. Morgan believed that power, true power, was the only way to ensure that the destruction of her people would never happen again. Over time, her path crossed with one of the most feared figures still serving the remnants of the Empire: Grand Admiral Thrawn. Thrawn was a strategist unlike any other officer in the Imperial command structure. He studied cultures, histories, and patterns of behavior to understand how entire civilizations thought and fought. When he learned about Morgan's past and her connection to the Nightsisters, he recognized something valuable. She understood survival. Morgan became one of Thrawn's loyal allies, using her industrial resources and political authority to support his campaigns across the galaxy. The Empire was weakening by that time, fractured by rebellion and internal struggles. But Morgan did not see the Empire as her true goal. She saw it as a tool, a way to rebuild strength, a way to one day reclaim what had been lost. The Nightsisters were gone, scattered across the galaxy like ashes after a fire. Yet through Morgan Elsbeth, their memory continued moving quietly through the corridors of power, waiting, watching, and slowly gathering the strength needed for something that had not yet happened, a return. The Nightsisters no longer existed as a civilization. The covens that once filled the swamps of Dathomir had been scattered across the galaxy, their fortress destroyed, their rituals nearly forgotten. The Clone Wars had erased them in a single night of fire and metal, leaving behind only ruins and silence. Yet the story of the witches did not end there. It survived in fragments. In distant systems, whispers about the magics of Dathomir still circulated among smugglers and explorers. Some believed the witches had been nothing more than myths. Others claimed that the spirits of the fallen still wandered through the fog-covered swamps of their homeworld. Few people knew the truth. The Nightsisters had not completely vanished, so their legacy lived through the last survivors who carried the memory of the coven in different ways. Asajj Ventress walked the galaxy alone, no longer bound to the Sith or the witches who once guided her. Her path would eventually cross with Jedi Master Quinlan Vos during the final years of the Clone Wars. For a brief moment, she came close to something she had never known before: peace. But the shadow of her past never fully released its hold. Ventress continued drifting through the galaxy as a bounty hunter, her life shaped by the choices made long ago on Dathomir. On the ruined world itself, Merrin grew stronger with each passing year. She remained the last witch truly connected to the ancient rituals of her people. The spirits of the fallen coven still lingered in the swamps, and through them, Merrin slowly learned the magics that had once defined the Nightsisters. Her future would eventually lead her beyond the ruins of her homeworld. But for a long time, she remained the lone guardian of a civilization that no longer existed. And somewhere in the wider galaxy, Morgan Elsbeth continued gathering power in quiet, patient ways. The anger she carried for the slaughter of her people had not faded with time. If anything, it had grown stronger. The Nightsisters were no longer united. They were scattered memories, echoes carried by a few surviving voices across a galaxy that had already begun forgetting them. But history has a strange way of returning, because the power buried beneath the red soil of Dathomir had never truly disappeared. It was only waiting, and someday, some of the witches of that dead world would rise again. For many years, the galaxy believed Dathomir was dead. After the massacre carried out by General Grievous and the separatist army, the swamp world slowly faded from the attention of the wider galaxy. The Clone Wars ended. The Republic collapsed. The Empire rose and eventually fell again. History moved forward. But Dathomir remained frozen in silence. Few travelers ever dared visit the planet. Those who passed through the Outer Rim sometimes reported strange things: ruined stone structures buried in marshland, forests twisted by an unseen power, and a faint green mist rising from the ground at night. Most dismissed these stories as superstition. Yet the Force never truly forgets. Beneath the red soil of Dathomir, and the same Ichor that had once fueled the magic of the Nightsisters still flowed through the planet's depths. The destruction of the coven had silenced their rituals, but it had not erased the ancient energy tied to their world. Sometimes the swamp stirred with unnatural movement. Sometimes the fog carried faint whispers. The spirits of the fallen witches had never fully disappeared. Across the galaxy, knowledge of the Nightsisters slowly turned into legend. Scholars within the New Republic archives described them as an extinct culture, a mysterious group of dark side practitioners who had vanished during the chaos of the Clone Wars. But legends often hide unfinished stories, because long before Dathomir was discovered by the Republic, the witches had come from somewhere else, a place even older than their swamp world. Yet in somewhere in the vast darkness beyond the known galaxy, ancient figures who remembered that origin were beginning to move once again. Years later, the past of the Nightsisters began to surface again through a woman who carried their legacy in a very different way. Her name was Morgan Elsbeth. By the time the New Republic had risen from the ashes of the Empire, Morgan had already become a powerful figure in the Outer Rim. She ruled the industrial city of Caladan on the forest world of Corvus, surrounded by factories and soldiers who enforced her authority. To the outside galaxy, she appeared to be nothing more than a ruthless magistrate, but the anger she carried came from somewhere much older. Morgan had never forgotten the destruction of her people. When the Nightsisters were slaughtered during the Clone Wars, the event left a deep wound in her life. That wound slowly shaped every decision she made afterward. While others moved on from the war, Morgan quietly searched for ways to restore the power that had once belonged to the witches of Dathomir. Eventually, that search led her to something extraordinary: an ancient map. Hidden inside an old Nightsister temple was a star chart unlike any other in the New Republic archives. The map did not lead to a forgotten planet within the known galaxy. Instead, it pointed far beyond the familiar stars, to a distant world called Peridea. According to the oldest Nightsister traditions, Peridea had once been the original home of the ancient Dathomiri people, long before they arrived on Dathomir itself. It was a place tied to the earliest magics practiced by the witches. Sir Morgan believed the map represented more than history. It represented a return. And somewhere beyond the edge of the galaxy, something ancient was still waiting for the witches to come back. Beyond the edge of the known galaxy lay a world almost no one had ever seen: Peridea. According to the oldest stories whispered among the Nightsisters, this distant planet had once been the birthplace of their people. Long before the witches settled on Dathomir, the ancient Dathomiri civilization had lived there, practicing forms of magic even older than the rituals later used in the swamps. For centuries, those stories had been dismissed as myths. But when Morgan Elsbeth finally reached Peridea, the truth became impossible to ignore. Waiting among the ruins of that forgotten world were three figures known only as the Great Mothers. They were Nightsisters, far older than the covens that once ruled Dathomir. Their bodies appeared ancient and frail, but the power surrounding them was immense. Through the strange magics of their world, they had endured for generations far beyond the lifespan of ordinary beings. They had been waiting. The Great Mothers remembered the fall of the witches. They remembered the destruction of the covens and the silence that followed the massacre on Dathomir. To them, the Nightsisters had never truly vanished. Their lineage had simply been scattered across time and space. Now, through Morgan Elsbeth and her allies, a path back to the galaxy had opened again. One of those allies was a figure feared across the stars: Grand Admiral Thrawn. When Thrawn arrived on Peridea, he formed an alliance with the Great Mothers. Together, they began preparing for a journey that would carry the ancient magic of the Nightsisters into the galaxy once more. And with them, they carried something hidden inside sealed coffins, loaded aboard Thrawn's Star Destroyer. something that had once belonged to the witches of Dathomir. When the Star Destroyer Chimera finally left Peridea, it did not travel alone. Attached to it was a massive hyperspace transport ring known as the Eye of Sion, a machine powerful enough to carry the ship across the impossible distance between galaxies. Inside the Chimera's dark cargo holds were rows of sealed coffins taken from the catacombs of Peridea. The Great Mothers knew exactly what rested inside them: remains. The ancient bodies of Nightsisters who had died long ago, preserved within burial chambers older than the Republic itself. To most beings in the galaxy, death was an ending. But the witches of Dathomir had never believed that. For them, death was only a veil. As the Chimera arrived once again, in the familiar stars of the galaxy, the Great Mothers began preparing their rituals. The cargo they had brought with them would soon reach Dathomir, the world that had once become the second home of the witches, the same world where their coven had been nearly erased. Now the cycle was beginning to turn again. The lineage of the Nightsisters had endured exile, betrayal, war, and extinction. Their civilization had fallen beneath the armies of the Clone Wars, their survivors scattered across time. But their power had never truly disappeared. It had simply been waiting beneath the red soil of Dathomir, waiting in the spirits drifting through the swamps, and waiting beyond the stars on a forgotten world where ancient witches still remembered the past. And now, the witches were coming home. The galaxy once believed the Nightsisters were nothing more than a legend, a dark chapter erased by war. But legends do not die so easily. Sometimes they return,